Council work session to order. Today is Tuesday, May 11th. The time is 2:06 p.m. Meetings of the Municipal Council are now being held in hybrid fashion. Members of the public can continue to view council meetings on YouTube and Facebook, or they may attend in person in the council chamber at the Provo City Center, where there is limited seating available. The mayor, councilors, city staff, and any presenters are participating in the council chamber or by using Zoom webinar. You may notice that persons sitting on the dais together are not wearing masks. Each has been fully vaccinated. The coronavirus pandemic is not yet over, but vaccines are available now in Utah for everyone 16 and older. We encourage everyone who is eligible to get vaccinated. We encourage all people to protect themselves and others by following the protocols set by the CDC and our state and local health departments. Please stay safe and be kind. This meeting is being broadcast live on the web on the Provo City Council YouTube channel, where it will also be available for on-demand viewing. I remind participants to mute your microphone when not speaking so as to minimize the potential for background noises and conversations to be picked up, recorded, and broadcast for all to hear. I believe we have all council members present, either in person or virtually. And we also have Mayor Kafusi and Wayne Parker from the administration and members of council staff here as well. The opening prayer will be provided by Councilor Shannon Ellsworth.
Our dear kind Father in heaven, we're thankful for this day that we can gather together and carefully and prayerfully consider the needs of our community and the needs of each department. We're thankful for the tremendous amount of work that has gone into the preparation of this budget, the tentative budget, and all the work that goes into the consideration and expenses that occur throughout the year. Father in heaven, we pray that thou will bless us with open minds and that we can find the best possible solutions for the taxpayers in Provo. And we ask that thou will bless the Paxman family at this time. We say this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Although this is a public meeting, only the presenters and those invited by the council may speak or ask questions unless otherwise invited by the chair. For remote participants, please use the raise hand feature to indicate you would like to speak, and please wait until called upon by the council chair. First item is a presentation regarding council budget priorities for the fiscal year 2022 tentative budget, and this item is to be presented by Cliff Strachan, Executive Director of the Council.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and with any luck, we'll be done a little bit earlier than we originally planned. So those who are behind me on the agenda, please be watching and ready to jump in when it's your turn. Councilors, I'm going to pull up a little PowerPoint and share that with you. The assignment I was given today was to talk about, to compare the budget as proposed by Mayor Kafusi with the council priorities that were set back on April 20th. The council's letter to the mayor describing your policies or your priorities is on pages 8 and 9 of the budget, tentative budget, and then we'll be talking about the tentative budget or the budget highlights starting on page 23, I believe it is, of the budget book. And I will tell you that as of last night, there is an updated version that's available on the city's website. We haven't got that link. We haven't grabbed that link and shared it with you, but I would actually appreciate if one of our staffers would find it and then put it in the chat so that council can grab it if they want to refer to the most recent. And when I'm done with this section, maybe we can have John Borgett just walk through some of the changes that are in that. But let me talk to you about the priorities that you gave the mayor. This quote on the first page here of the presentation is straight from the highlights. describing the budget as supporting our ongoing goal of continued fiscal health and a sustainable budget. Monies are invested in capital improvements, vehicles, employees. Provo City employees are among the greatest and most critical assets the city has, and by investing in them, we are better able to recruit, develop, and retain top employees. Now, you may recall that on April 20th, the information you provided, and I'm just not sure why this isn't, I know why. Oh, here we go. Okay. So these are the five. The first priority that you listed was to improve retention and recruitment of employees by restoring the wages and benefits for existing positions. And we'll talk about that a little bit. The second item was to improve capacity in public safety, specifically talked about police officers. The third one is to improve zoning enforcement effectiveness, also talked about staffing in there. The fourth one was to make significant progress in implementing the strategic parking management plan. And some of the things in there about crafting implementation plan and things like that are something that's going to happen during the year, but may not have a direct budget impact as you look at it. The fourth one is, without detracting from those priorities, or I guess it's the fifth one, evaluate other positions and funding lost during the pandemic, and then prioritize to determine which should be restored, is the requirement here. So I had sent you a memo earlier today that describes all of these. You'll have that in your inbox. So the council priority of retaining existing employees and recruiting new employees by restoring the market wages and benefits, et cetera. These specific items in the budget are things like the employee health insurance has a 4.1% increase per, forget the name of it, Wayne, mill. It's not a mill rate, but it's a company that does the ratings. Anyway, $173,000 for that. Restoring merit pay and career series in the budget is $500,000. Putting in, or those are funded. Restoring market rate studies, employee recognition, sick leave buyouts, and travel and training budgets account for those dollars that you see on that screen there. The next one, and let me say with that, with respect to the tentative budget that the budget satisfies the intent and extent of the priority to improve retention of existing employees and recruitment of new employees by restoring the market wages and benefits. And then also we found a way, the administration's found a way to actually have more than one police officer added, which was the minimum that the council asked for. And one of the things that they're doing in there, I'm sorry, I jumped. Anyway, so that covered that. The second one is dealing with public safety, increasing the number of budget police officers. And as I said, if you look at the bottom three items on that box, the city has directly funded one police officer with money in the budget. And then the chief came up with an idea to reclassify two civilian positions I think are vacant, and then use the savings from that to fund a second officer. And then they've provided a transition time credit. It's my summary of what it does, but essentially what it does is it recognizes that there is a long lead time between recruiting an officer and having them on staff whenever they have departures and bring on new officers. This would actually allow them to, in effect, have an extra officer on staff and be able to have that officer in place, recognizing just the natural tendency of the department to lose officers and gain officers during the course of a normal year. That's one way they've handled that. We'd also talked about, in earlier meetings, we talked about the need to do a market rate study for fire employees. That was done. The cost there is on the top right of that page. And then also they had talked about one of the programs they had was to help with the paramedic service, and they funded some money in there for promotions of firefighters to become paramedics. Move those within. So the feeling is that they've met the minimum requirements of the council priority on that item. The third item was improve zoning enforcement, effectiveness, efficiency, and retention in the department by implementing the recommendations from the council and zoning committee to restore the department to its budget level of 6 officers, create a field supervisor position among those, and provide funds for departmental branding and educational opportunities. Now, code enforcement falls within the community neighborhood services in much of the work they've done. So this one, this particular item, I've captured things that go to that department and also development services. The proposal is to fund 2 code compliance officers and to fund 2 community and neighborhood services staffers that were formerly funded under the CDBG program, and then to add 1 of a requested 2 economic development officers, and to provide some development services with operating expenses that didn't adequately get funded 2 years ago when the department split from development services into the 2 departments. So those are there. My summary of that part of this item is that the proposal addresses zoning enforcement as it restores the 2 vacant positions, but does not specify the creation of the field officer. And it also addresses other planning and development issues, as I've already mentioned. Fourth item is to make significant progress implementing the strategic parking and management plan, and to include selecting and presenting options and crafting an implementation plan for adoption by the council, with particular attention to the creation of a parking management enterprise fund. Now, some of the elements below the third line of that are effectively things that need to be done during the year, really don't have a direct budget impact unless we create that enterprise fund. But I believe some work needs to be done before that is. So what has been funded in here is a parking coordinator. You will recall that council approved an appropriation recently that started that process, and the tentative budget continues that funding into the new year. And then also, as you can see, an ATV for downtown parking, license plate reader, and radios will help with the parking effort. The final priority that you listed was essentially, without detracting from other priorities, evaluate other positions and funding lost during the pandemic, and consider the changing needs and priorities of our citizens, consider advances in technology, and prioritize to determine which should be restored, which might need to be deferred to a subsequent budget year, and which should be eliminated. Where I've identified monies going into the budget, Information Services has infrastructure funding of $642,000 being drawn from the telecom fund and the equipment replacement fund. That'll help making sure that the new building has the modern standard of different infrastructure that we need, for instance, networking, phone system, the wireless network, and I can't remember what SAN stands for, but it's about storage and area network or something like that. But they'll have monies to make sure that the new building is top notch when it comes to the technology. Now, they did not fund any additional information systems staffers, but they did also put in place other positions that needed. So we've got an engineer, recreation program coordinator, and I think at a cost savings, 2 fleet interns rather than a full-time staffer in there. And then one thing I will say, anything that's listed in these estimates as a dollar amount, recognize that those may seem high, but those are what I call the burden costs. Those have the way, not only salaries, but also benefits and payroll requirements that the city has to fund. So in summary, These are the five items as I've concluded them. But I'd also say to you that the greatest challenge in addressing all these priorities is the limited funds available. The restoration of budget cuts from FY 2021 consumed $2.1 million. Dozens of supplemental requests. We'll discuss that separately, and I'm not including those requests. Those requests weren't part of the budget allocations or in terms of the total, but supplemental requests totaled $3.95 million, and only 19 were funded on an ongoing basis for a total of about $384,000. And 1.2 million one-time funds were spent on 10 requests, including, and I think council will appreciate these ones, $60,000 for a sustainability plan and about $323,000 for wayfinding signage. Those are the big ticket items under the one-time items. And we can talk about other supplemental requests later when we at another date when we bring that to you. My question now is, do you have any questions?
Mr. Hardy?
I have several questions. I do think a couple of these items we have as actual agenda items that we'll be diving into more. So I'll hold off on that. But I don't know if is Mr. Morgan available right now? Do we know if he's?
My screen doesn't show me him, but he's probably here. There he is.
Okay, just and I don't really mind whoever wants to answer these, but so looking at the first box, the council priority is retention and recruitment. So the first line is employee health insurance, and it's 173,000. I assume that that's just the increase over last year, and I assume also that last year, even though we were going into the pandemic and we were not certain how things were going to play out, but I assume that we also had an increase last year as well for that number. Okay, just for those that are remote, the answer was yes. There was an increase last year that we covered, and an additional increase again this year. The merit/career series restores is a little over $500,000. Is it safe to assume that last year we did not include an increase? We just held static. So in some ways that this is kind of a delayed and a makeup for last year, as well as the increase we would normally do this year.
Let's have John.
Oh, yes. Okay, thank you.
If you want me to respond, I can respond, or unless you've already got your question answered.
Go ahead, Mr. Morgan.
Yes, I'll just mention a couple things. First of all, the medical insurance increase, the Millman index that Cliff referred to, that's effective on our plan year, which is calendar year. So this increase is for half a year, which will be effective in January of 2022. And that Millman index is kind of a national index. And we look at that, and we have kind of made an agreement with the employees a number of years ago that we would match that index as far as the amount of money that goes into their to pay for their medical coverage. And then we actually have the experience of the plan to determine what the increase is that goes to the employees. It's pretty close. Actually, our experience is actually a little bit less this year, which is good. So that's the answer to that question. On the question on the merit increases, we did give merit increases last year. And so we did it last year as well as this year. What we didn't do last year was a market study. And due to COVID and everything that was going on, and the market everything was crazy, we didn't do a market study. And so this year we did. And as a result of skipping a year, it was quite a bit more expensive, but we did do the market study this year.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful on that. And then you answered the next question I had about the market rate studies. Employee recognition, That 101, that's not an increase, but that's a total for employee recognition for this year? Or is that an increase over last year?
That's the total. And what that is that we have in the budget $150 per full-time employee. And that goes into each department's budgets to handle for employee recognition. And then what they can do is determine based on performance and accomplishments who of their employees they reward with that employee recognition.
And was that cut last year?
David, I don't think it was included last year. Do you know, David?
Yeah, that's correct. It was not included in the budget last year, so it's being restored this year.
And then, and same with the sick leave buyout was not included last year. We're restoring it this year, but not necessarily making up, just going forward. And then travel and training as well, I assume, was cut last year. And the 76 represents the total, not just an increase over last year. Is that correct?
That's the total amount that was cut that's being restored. And there was still maybe some small amounts out there of some travel and training, but it was substantially cut, and that's what that represents.
Okay. Thank you. I do have a few other questions, but I'm happy to yield the floor if there's other questions.
Thank you. And just a quick follow-up on the sick leave buyback. So if I'm understanding this right, prior to the pandemic, employees were able to buy back any accrued sick leave. We didn't allow that last year. And now we're allowing it again this year in the proposed budget. But is the amount budgeted, is it higher than would be typical because of that year's gap? Or is it about the same?
I would say no. And so just to kind of define it a little bit to make sure that the council and the public understands. What we've had as a practice for many years is roughly in the November, late October timeframe, HR would go in and review. And what happens is all employees, full-time employees, they're eligible for 96 hours of sick leave per year. And what we do is we track the usage on the sick leave. And if there's an employee, for example, that didn't use any sick leave during the year, then they would take that 96 hours and they would buy back half of it, roughly 48 hours. If they had used a portion of it and only had like 60 hours left, then they would buy back half of that 60, which is 30. And kind of the reasoning and the logic and why it's worked well is number one, it encourages employees to be to work and not just use sick leave as another type of leave. It also helps from building up balances so they become larger. There is some advantage to having some sick leave build up, but the idea was to just not have the balances just build to become very large. And so anyway, it's worked out. It's been timely. They usually received their sick leave buyback around Thanksgiving time frame, and it's been a good thing for the city as well as the employees. Now, what happened in the year in last year when we didn't do a sick leave buyout, those balances, the employees just kept those, and it really made good sense with COVID because we had more people that were sick and wanted to be able to use those balances so that because they weren't able to come to work, and so it worked out well that way. But what we're doing this year is that beginning of that time frame will be that same time frame, like from November to October. And so they'll go back and look at the sick leave from November of 2020 to October of roughly this time frame of 2021. And then based on the amount that wasn't used, we would buy back half of that balance. And so that's how it would work. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Chair Sewell?
Thank you. Are there other questions? I guess we're back to you, Mr. Harding.
Right. Thank you. So on the second box, we talked about improve the capacity of public safety. And we said, that it was characterized that the council's request was a minimum of one. The request, at least as I understand it, is that we were requesting an amount that is at least commensurate, with population growth over the past 2 years, and not less than one. And so I just in the budget, or in our conversation, I haven't heard if we took a measurement, if we looked at the number of population growth over the past 2 years and to see if that suggested more than one. And so I don't necessarily need the number or an answer right now, but I would be interested in if we looked at population growth and to see if it justified more than one. And I believe my other two questions can be answered in, or maybe already will be answered in future items.
Mr. Hanley, thank you.
Yeah, I had a similar question about the numbers. I mean, I was just Googling population, so who knows if this is accurate. It doesn't look like the population grew significantly, but I don't know how recent the 2021 figures are, but based on a quick glance, it's only 100 people in 2 years, but that doesn't seem right. But I'm actually more interested in the fact that we talked about not needing 9 and a longer term plan for how to fund those positions, or at least a longer term commitment to do so to the extent we felt like we could. So I don't know if that's something that we need to be, I guess I'm proposing that we talk through that also, because I mean, if we're going to do 2 and we still have 7 that we ideally need, are we going to be prepared to do 3 or 4 next year, 3 or 4 the year after that? Or would it be better to say, let's take a bolder step now and fund 3 and 3 and 3? Anyway, I just think we need to be thinking about that longer term commitment that we had talked about.
Thank you, Mr. Hanley. Mr. Fillmore.
Yes, thank you, Chair Sewell. I want to just piggyback on Mr. Handley's comments. The chief asked for 9 new officers, and I wanted to make sure we were clear that we weren't flat out rejecting that request. I think the council as a whole always wants to be very supportive of our public safety personnel. And if the chief is convinced that we need that many, the only issue in my mind was just timing. I think we had a sense that didn't need all 9 right away, because the majority of those new officers are tied to the airport, and that we could add officers over time as the airport is developed and opens up the new terminal and expands thereafter. So I think I would appreciate a little more guidance from the chief as to his timeline on when he absolutely needs those additional officers, particularly with respect to the airport.
Thank you, Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
I need to issue a correction. I had misunderstood, and I had just told you about $1.2 million of one-time money was funded. Those items were not. So I will correct my memo and reissue that to you.
Thank you. Mr. Harding.
Thank you. I apologize. I did have one more question mark on my sheet that I forgot to ask. So I've read a little bit about this transition time credit. I think it's called here on different budgets or different documents, I should say. And I'm still struggling to wrap my head around exactly what it is. Based on the last description, it almost sounds like if we have 120 officers budgeted, we know that one's going to be retiring. And if we wait for them to retire to start the recruitment and training process, we won't have an officer really filling in that hole, for some time. And so it sounds like the transition time credit could be where we know someone's retiring in 6 months. Therefore, we start the recruitment process and training process now, so that when they retire, we have a trained officer to immediately fill in. But in some of the other reading I did, that was not the impression I got. It almost sounded like we were taking the $116,000 times two, and then saying, well, we're budgeting it that now, but we're not actually going to fill it and start using that immediately. So we're going to have this kind of pot left over once they are hired and are going. And so let's use that money for other things. So is there, whether it's John or whomever, can I get a better understanding of what's going on there?
Thank you, Mr. Harding. There's two different things going on here. So let me try to segregate those out. So the two new officers that are being proposed in the budget, one, a net increase in FTEs in the department, the other by converting two vacant civilian positions to a full-time officer, assumes that we will have those officers ready to hit the ground running in July. As you probably know, over time, we have allowed the police department to occasionally exceed its number of authorized positions if those additional positions are in the academy or in the process of being hired, so that we can start that. So we will have, we'll hopefully be really close to July 1 when the budget's approved, that we can actually add those two net officers to this system. Now, again, the 116, let me just remind you, includes not only salary and benefits for a year, but also includes equipment, uniforms, vehicle. So again, the compensation for those police officers is 116,000. So in terms of what Cliff's termed as transition time, I think that's a fair description. It's a little more nuanced than that. And let me just maybe share my experience having watched this over the years, and it's been very consistent over the 18 city budgets I've now been through in Provo, and 42 across my career. So that gives you a little, maybe I've been here too long, but there are some that would agree with me probably. But our experience has been that when we get through the fiscal year, we typically end up not spending anywhere near what we have budgeted. Well, I shouldn't say that. We end up spending not as much as we have budgeted for personnel. And that happens in a variety of ways. It could be employees who retire. It could be employees who move to another department. It could be employees who decide to get out of the profession of law enforcement. And so what we have historically done over time is, as we've evaluated getting close to the end of the budget year, whether there have been savings essentially in personnel, we have then gone out and, for example, authorized the police department to buy up a bunch of ammunition because they've been consistently underfunded in ammunition. We may authorize them to buy additional equipment. It could be firearms, it could be protective equipment, and so on. And so again, as we started looking at this and thinking, because we have kind of chronically underfunded operations and more than fully funded personnel, we thought maybe it was a smart idea to do a little bit of a correction and say, rather than waiting until the end of the fiscal year, when we know very consistently we're going to have several $100,000 remaining in the budget, that we would take 176 of that and apply it to the ongoing operations budget, not personnel. And so again, so rather than ending up with a pot of money at the end of the year that we're trying to scramble to figure out what to do with, let's apply some of that likely pot of money into the budget decisions that we make now. And so that's what's changed. So the department budget in total hasn't changed. It's just how we program those dollars. So that's the 176,000 transition. And again, it can happen in a variety of ways. It's not just, we're 6 months behind trying to hire someone. Sometimes things happen unexpectedly. And again, our experience is that happens very consistently every year. And this is actually a fraction of what we have seen historically. So we'll still have this discussion at the end of the year about carryovers or some other approach. What this really does is allow the department to budget those things early rather than right at the end of the fiscal year in a hurry up fashion. Does that make sense?
I think so. So let me just state it back to you. So one, these are not directly tied to the positions that we're talking about elsewhere here. Two, we are setting a number of FTEs, number of officers that we're going to fund, and we're going to fully fund them. And then we're also kind of from that, we're going to then take a small portion of that and say, we know that if we're fully funding all these positions, we're not actually going to spend all of those dollars. So we're going to take some of that and plug it into other budget needs within the department.
That's it. Yep.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions on this item?
Chief said he'll jump on in 5 minutes if you have any questions for him.
Oh, great.
Okay.
Thank you for checking with him on that. So we'll come back to that. I guess we can, let's see. I guess we could start on, let's see, how should we do this? How long is the anticipated presentation on the next one?
About half an hour, depending on how much conversation there is around it.
Yeah,
I think you could interrupt it, maybe let him have his presentation, and then put the chief on.
let him get started. Okay. All right, let's move on to item number 2. Yes.
If it's helpful, I could ask some of these other questions that relate to future things, but we could have that 5-minute discussion if that helps.
Okay, well, if you've got questions, let's go ahead.
All right, thank you. So I think I'll jump. It's the last box where we talk about without detracting from the other priorities. And I think the mayor had stated kind of a goal of try to get back to pre-COVID status, and based on our priorities, as I understand them, we were saying our top priority is to restore the market wages and benefits for retention and recruitment. And then, but our last priority was this, without detracting from other priorities, evaluate the positions and funding loss, so that other part of the getting back to pre-pandemic. So I guess 2 questions on here. One, in here we were discussing the 642,000 for the telecom fund and equipment replacement. So I guess one question on that is how is that applicable to that goal? 2, I'm trying to understand how this was a funding gap. Was this not budgeted in the new building? And then the third question I would have is and maybe this is for Mr. Strachan, but the last bullet point in kind of the narrative talks about restoring 7 positions, but I count 4 positions listed in the box. I was curious, do we know what the other are these? Oh, also in above. Okay.
Try to separate these out.
Okay, so I guess the applicability of the telecom fund and replacement, equipment replacement based on this goal, and then even broader, why did we have that funding gap?
So let me try to address that if I can, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. So a couple of things on these expenses related to the new building. So there are a couple of things. And again, I'm not sure I would necessarily characterize them as restoring to prior pandemic levels. These are expenses that we've been pondering and trying to figure out. So essentially, when we began the process of looking at the new building, the supposition was that we could, for the most part, move our existing IT infrastructure over to the new building. The truth of the matter is that, number one, our phone system is 25 years old. And it's been in need of replacement for some time. It's bordering on failure, a lot of features that we couldn't apply. And again, the IT staff and our telephone system consultant said it will be very expensive to move. It will also be extremely time consuming to move, which means that the city's phone system could be down for days, if not longer. And so one of those components is to essentially upgrade the phone system, have it in the new building so that when we move out of an old phone system into a new one, just rather than physically relocating it. The second piece really is kind of around the server infrastructure and data security. And again, part of the concern was, yes, we could physically pick up and move those servers. There are dozens of them in the infrastructure. That also creates some substantial downtime in terms of the movement from the old city hall to the new city hall. And so we will move many of them, but not all of them. And again, the thinking was if we could move and virtualize the servers in the new building, they might be overcrowded for a bit while we moved some of the existing servers into the new building and then reallocate the data. But that would significantly minimize downtime. So these were things that we just, again, hadn't really fully fleshed out in the budget as we were laying out the costs of the new building. And so again, these were things that we kind of discovered as we got into our process and knew it was a gap we were going to have to fill at some point. And so rather than coming to you with a separate appropriation during the year, and these are both out of fund balances, not general fund balance, but out of system fund balances. The equipment replacement fund is a fund balance item where we've built up money over time for equipment replacement. The other is a fund, again, where city departments have been putting in overtime to handle future data infrastructure needs. And so we're just bringing it to you as an appropriation in the budget as opposed to doing something separate. So that's the backstory on that one. And again, if you have other questions, we'd be happy to get into more detail and as we go through the budget retreat meetings.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
Thank you. And I'm told that Chief is ready to join us. Is that right, Mayor? Let's see, and then Mr. Fillmore, I know, had a question for him. So as soon as we can get him on, we'll call on.
Actually, Chair Sewell, my question is more for Wayne right now.
Oh, okay. Well, go ahead while we're trying to get the chief on.
Okay. Wayne, thank you for the clarification on the IT equipment. My concern that I want to raise, and I've raised it before and got a somewhat satisfying response. I was a bit vague in a prior meeting, was that our software for cybersecurity is top rate. I've been concerned about the potential for ransomware problem. And of course, that's back in the news again with respect to the hacking of this pipeline from Houston to the East Coast. How confident are you and your people that our software for cybersecurity is 5 stars?
Well, let me suggest a couple of things. First, we'd love to go into some detail with the council on that. Obviously, we don't want to do it in a public setting. And so if you'd like to get into some detail on that, we'd be happy to do that in an executive session where we don't disclose all of our security secrets. In terms of cybersecurity, as you know, we have beefed up our staff in IT over the last couple of years. We actually also hired a couple of years ago, and we just hired a brand new one recently as our prior analyst left. But we have a cybersecurity expert that reports directly to John Borgett, not through IT, and that routinely tests our security, internal, external hacking efforts. Sending phishing emails and seeing how many city employees click on them, and then mandating those, including myself in one very convincing phishing email that required me to take another hour of training on my own personal email standards. So I'm among the victims of that. But again, we do have a very robust testing process and trying to examine if we have holes and how to fill them. Be happy to have John Borgett maybe respond in terms of greater emphasis, but I can suggest to you that if you compare how comfortable I was 3 years ago, I am infinitely more comfortable today. Am I 100% confident? I'm not sure anybody could really legitimately say that, but I'm pretty close to 100%. So, John, I don't know if you would like to weigh in on that specific question as well.
Sure. The other thing I would mention is that we're fortunate in the city. We have some great resources. In addition to Tyler Dennis, who is the young man that Wayne was referring to, we also have Matt Dunlap, who is a security expert. And so I think we've got some great resources, but but I think it would be a good discussion item in an executive session. Are we 100% comfortable and know that we're never going to have a problem? Not so, but we are doing some things, and we would love to have further discussions in an executive session. Also, love for you to get a chance to meet Tyler. He's only been with us about 6 weeks, and he comes with experience. He worked for the Canyon School District as well as the Provo School District in security, and he recently just got his master's degree in cybersecurity. So I'd love to have you meet him sometime.
Well, thank you, both John and Wayne. My question obviously wasn't intended to elicit any confidential information today, but your assurances are very helpful. I'm really only asking if we need to consider a budget appropriation to improve and enhance our cybersecurity. I would welcome that discussion in closed session.
Okay, thanks.
And would ask Chair Sewell maybe to arrange for that in the future sometime.
Thank you. Let's plan on that. I guess time flies when you're having fun. I didn't realize we're almost 20 minutes over schedule on this item, so we're going to have to hustle. I think we better move on to item number 2, and then if to answer the question that was raised. All right, item number 2 is presentation on fiscal year 2022 budget, all fund revenue forecast, and this was to be presented by John Magnus, policy analyst.
There we go. Good afternoon, Council. So we go through the all fund balance. First I would say is this year is a little more complicated because COVID had a drag on FY20, the entire FY21, and how much drag is going to have on FY22 is kind of hard to say at this present time. What we do, those are the actual years that are reported. These are the either adopted or proposed budgets. And there's a couple ways we analyze it. One quick way is look at year-over-year growth and what is it averaged out. So if you back all the way up to 2014 to 2020, the average growth in sales tax has been 4.1%. Another way we look at it is we look at what the proposed budget was and was actually the actual was, and then look at the difference. So for fiscal year 20, the actual was almost 4% higher than what was proposed. What we do this for is just look for trends to make sure they're hitting the marks, that they're forecasting this correct. For sales tax, we expect at minimum a 4% increase over the last 2 years. It's a substantial increase of 17% this year. Part of that is if you look at the quarterly reports we've been getting, sales tax for FY21, it looks to be on target to be 10% higher than was actually budgeted. So if you add that in and then add in what we're going to increase it for FY22, it's how you get to the 17. It should be pretty close to what it is. So we do that for every line. So utility, these are the actuals. These last 2 numbers, if you just take the actual growth from year over year and you plug it into the last number, kind of a number that you're going to get. So we expect to see a minimum of 22 million. They're forecasting 23 million. Is really close. Utility sales, they've grown a little over 300% a year. Again, if you plug in that into the formula, we're going to get about 114 million in sales, which is close to what they had. Property tax is a little different. We had a big step up in it because of the city center. So doing some of the calculations is a little bit harder. But if you look at how their return over what they expected, it's been pretty high, 1.6. So it still falls in there because it's only asking for 1.86% increase. Fees, these are all fees we collected from the park, building fees, basically any kind of fee we have. Again, it's been ranging 1.7% year over year as an average. It has not performed very well compared to, if you look at what they budget to what they bring in, it's averaged about 1% lower. But if you take that number and you add in, it's going to be close. But remember, we are playing with high level numbers here. I don't have all the budget details, so I can't explain everything away. The chargebacks, again, that's grown every year. They've missed it a little bit every year, but not too much. The RAP tax, that has grown year over year of almost over 5%. They beat their projections by 1.6%. So again, that number is a good number. Franchise fees, this one is grown a little over 0.5%, and they missed it. They've been about 1% lower every year from actuals to what they forecasted, but still it's right in the ballpark. Grants is a hard one because we never know what we're going to get. The grants fund specific things. So if the grant doesn't show up, that whatever it was going to be funded goes away. So it's not like we have to make up for it somewhere in the general fund. The project just doesn't go forward. The telecom, they hold flat every year, but it does seem to produce better every year. It does like 3% more than what they actually are predicting. B&C roads, that grows about 4% year over year. It's outperformed its expectations by 1.32%. So that number's right in the ballpark. Fines are one that got hit hard by COVID because of the court system. So they have a decrease of 25% this coming year. Hopefully the backlog will start clearing up and then start correcting it. They were generating about an 8% a year increase year over year. But this one is very hard to predict because of COVID. Miscellaneous is one that we're having a problem with. Not a problem. It was just that the way that some of the stuff gets coded in, it doesn't get coded in right. It gets coded into the wrong column. Land sales, some of the land sales got coded into miscellaneous. That's why you see such a variation in these top three numbers compared to the bottom three numbers. And we're going to go through, they're going to try to correct that and actually get those things in the right line. But again, they've always done pretty well over projections. The other one, that is the other one that they're, yeah.
Could we pause for just a minute? I just saw that Chief is now on with us on the Zoom. So we'll come back to you in just a minute. Counselor Fillmore had a question for the chief. Could you go ahead and restate that, Mr. Fillmore?
Sure. Good afternoon, Chief.
Welcome.
My earlier comment had to do with the number of officers you had requested a few months ago for the new budget. And I wanted to be clear in your mind that the council, I think as a whole, was not outright rejecting your request for that total number, but wanting to maybe time it according to your needs with the new airport. And we just wanted to get a better sense of year by year when you would need those additional officers to staff your airport functions as the airport is developed and expanded.
Hi, sorry, Council. So what I asked for was I asked for 5 officers in this budget year coming up. And the reason I asked for those 5 was because of the expansion of the airport, which is going to be basically launched in about 18 months is what I'm told. It takes me roughly a year to identify, do a background, and train a police officer and get them out on the road. The officers that I have in mind to go to the new airport would not be brand new rookie officers. They would come off the street. They're current officers on the street. They'd be veteran officers. but I have to have something to replace them, because as I've told you before in other budget meetings, we're short on officers as it is. So to take officers off of our current staffing and put them at the airport, just going to cripple us even more. So anticipating ahead, I understand it's 18 months out before the launch, but if I could get started now preparing for that, that was what my desire was to do.
I see. Is the number of officers you need to have at the airport a function of federal law based on traffic patterns, flight numbers, that kind of thing? Or is it your best estimate is what it's going to take just to handle everything out there?
Yeah, I'm not following any code or law. It is strictly myself and my command staff's best estimate of what we will need to have proficiency and professionalism at the airport, to have a full-time staff out there that really know what airport policing is about. It like corrections, it's its own policing. We have a lot of vulnerabilities to our airport that I'm concerned about, and currently I send an officer to the airport on an overtime shift, but that officer is not versed in airport policing per se. As the shifts or as the flights begin to pick up and we start to see an increase in travelers and guests coming into our city, I anticipate that it would be the right thing to do safety-wise to have a dedicated team out there.
So do I take from this then your sense that it's absolutely imperative to have that full complement of new officers you're asking for in the upcoming budget? That there's no ability to stretch that even one extra year?
Well, anticipating in the last couple of weeks that I may not get those officers, we've started to make a contingency plan. I'm gonna stick with what I brought to you a couple of months ago, that yes, I believe that the best thing for the city is to have a full-time team out there. And right now that would be a dedicated team of 5. Whether I can wait and stretch it out, I understand the budget. I understand how tight things are, and I understand what a huge ask this is of the city. We've talked in past years about budgeting for outcomes, and this is an outcome that I have that we have to fill. And I'm just looking at that 1.5 year mark, that I'm trying to make that mark by then.
Okay, fair enough, understood.
Thank you.
Mr. Hanley, did you have a question for the chief?
Yes, I did. I'm curious, Chief, if I can get some more clarification on logistics. So if you needed the 5 in 1.5 years and you had, and we, I mean, I don't know, our concern is that if we couldn't fund all of your requests right away, we would want to have some sort of plan to make sure that we could over time. And if there's a little bit of time to borrow here while you're searching and preparing for those replacements, so that we actually fund part of the 5 now and the rest of the 5 next year, is that feasible for you to get those replacements, or does that is there something about funding them now that makes it is the only way to get those employees ready in time, I guess is the question. Because you say 1.5 years and it takes a year, but if you knew that you were going to have the 5, but maybe 2 or 3 were coming now, and then the other 2 or 3 was coming in a year, would that be workable?
It would be, yeah, and that's exactly, sir, what we've been working on is that plan B. And so yes, it would be. We're actively trying to continue to hire lateral police officers from other agencies with experience. That's a big savings of time for us. It's not always easy, but it's something that we really are. We have a strong recruitment process in place. If we could if we could get on some kind of a schedule like that where we could be ready to go at the airport, that would be a good thing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. We really appreciate all that you and your department do, and appreciate you taking a few minutes out of whatever you were doing to join us and answer those questions.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Thanks. All right, let's jump back to Mr. Magnus and resume your presentation.
All right, going on with P&I, principal and interest. For the last FY 21 and 22, they've been slowly dropping it. The FY 20, they missed their recommendations by 47%. But that all has to vary with our funds, what we have in when we draw out. That one's kind of hard to say exactly what's going to happen with it. Land sales are not put in the proposed budget because we don't know what land is going to be sold or what its value is. But on average for the last 6 years, sold $900,000 of land every year. The bonds are another one that's a difficult one. Depends on the time of the year they get sold and stuff. They did budget some in this year, 28,000, which is an increase over last year. Transfers in, they're expecting $29 million in transfer in. If you look at the previous years, they've beaten their estimates by 4%, and transfers year over year have increased by 6.75%. If you do the math, it could almost be up to $33 million. So what happens is this is the total with bonds. So the total all funds for FY22 is $327,906,102. It's just over 5.5% increase from the previous year. They've been averaging a little over 6.5% every year. So it's still within that margin. And the budgets have performed on average about 7.5% better than the proposed budgets. So if you take the bonds out, because those are kind of volatile, if you look at it, what we're looking at is only a 1.83% increase from the last year's. And year over year, it's been about 6.7%. So I think they've taken a very conservative approach to this next cycle, not knowing exactly how COVID is going to affect 21 and what it's going to do to 22. But all in all, the funds seem very balanced, and the projections seem very close to what we would expect to see. Are there any questions?
I just had a quick one for you, Mr. Magnus.
Sure.
Appreciate the analysis. That was a lot of numbers to absorb quickly, but I just wanted to restate my overall impression and see if I caught the gist of it. It sounds like your analysis of the forecasting methods is that they are very conservative, but in line with what we've typically done. But I noticed several of the numbers, like the sales tax, for example, your number was significantly higher than what is currently being forecast. Did I catch that correctly? And I guess my question is, I mean, we've got some pressing needs, like, for example, in the police department that we just discussed about. And I understand the wisdom in being very conservative on the forecast. But the other side of that coin is if we're too conservative, then we may be not able to hire as many officers as we apparently desperately need to. So I'm just trying to weigh those opposing forces. And I guess I'm not really sure exactly what my question is, but
Right. So my sales tax number comes in $1 million lower than they're projecting, but they have more data. They have a half year's worth of FY21 to look at. So the problem with doing what we do, how we look at the budget, we're looking back. Our last year that we can look at as an actual as FY20. 21, we're halfway through, and we're trying to project through another 5 quarters, the end of 22. Makes it difficult. So when we look at a budget and analyze what the work that John and his shop did, all we're trying to do is, hey, we can use these different measurements. What's the year-over-year growth? What's the difference between what you proposed and actually came in? And what is your year-over-year growth of your adopted budgets? And we can look at all those numbers and come up with a sense. If you looked at utilities, utilities for the last 5 years have never made the actual budget that's been proposed. But, you know, I think it was, what was it? It was $1 million off. It's not that big of a deal in this large budget that they're dealing with. So that's all we can really do with the projections. John's shop, if you want to get down to nitty gritty, he can probably do some forecasting off of this year's numbers and tell you what they are. That's why when we looked at sales tax and it was such a large jump at 17%, and I talked to John, it's because this year for FY21, the yearly growth is going to be about 10%, which is 2.5 times the normal growth of year over year. So because of that, you can actually step it up 17% in for FY22. So if you're trying to squeeze more money out, that's always a possibility, but we'd have to have digger deep into the numbers. This is just kind of a product view. And like I said, it's a little bit scary because COVID affected so many different things. We're not getting a nice smooth line like we would like with 5 years or 6 years of data. We have this spike in it because of COVID. We see it in the fees, some of the property tax, some of the utilities. COVID did have an effect, and trying to smooth that out, we could, but it would just take a little more computation on our side. It would help a John's shop to try to figure it out. But if you look at the total all fund balance for 20, it was almost 4% higher than what they had budgeted. So it was an extra $10 million in the fund, all funds that came in prior to then what they expected. They expected 282,808,455, and the actual for FY20 was 294,353,706. So John's shop does a very good job of coming in very close to their numbers.
thank you. Counselor Shipley.
Yeah, so this is really helpful. I appreciate it, John, and your work on it. I'm trying to get a sense for what you said earlier at the end, which was that on average we grow revenues by, I think you said 5% a year. Probably taking an average over the past just 4 years. Is that?
I think we're using 6 years of data right now.
So we're using 6 years of data. We average about a 5% revenue increase each year. On our current numbers, that's approximately $15-16 million of revenue growth. Is that accurate total?
Yeah, about that.
So I guess one of the things that would be helpful to me is, I was trying to look through the budget to see trend lines over the past 4 years, because it shows, I think, 4 years worth of data on the proposed budget, and look at different departments and how their expenses have changed over the past 4 years. I would have a hard time just, reading the proposed budget the way I have, understanding how or where, 15 million is being assumed, as far as, it's obviously not in the departmental budgets, increases each year. I wouldn't be able to aggregate those and come up with that amount of difference. One of the things that would be helpful to me is if we're going to say, on average, our revenue goes up by 4 or 5% a year, it'd be an interesting exercise to find out where that gets consumed, right? Where that excess gets consumed. I think I have some of it in my mind, as far as, increases and different things that we've talked about today, but not nearly that amount. And so it'd be great to know how we're growing government by $15 million a year, for people to understand where that goes and where it's being, where it's being assumed.
One of the shortcomings with looking at just the all funds is some of that money could be going into a designated fund that can only be touched for certain things, like a wastewater fund. So some of it could be captured on that side, with some of it being transferred back to the general fund. So we're looking at all revenues that are generated, but we're not actually looking at where they land.
Yeah, and I guess what I'm saying is it'd be helpful, to chart the last 4 or 5 years and see where $10 to $15 million of additional revenue went, because I think we know as a council that there are, like enterprise funds, for example, have their own capital improvement funds. All the utilities have their own, capital improvement funds that they're trying to raise funds for and save for the future. But I don't think that the average citizen in Provo would understand, hey, we're growing, revenues in total by 10 to 15 million. I think it would be a helpful exercise to understand where those funds generally are going, because they're not all going back to general fund. They're not all going to expenses increasing each year. They're not all going to inflationary pressures. But some of them are all going, but some of that money is going to all those things. And I think it'd be helpful to understand just in a snapshot how those funds are being consumed.
Okay. And one last note on this: the CARES Act and the American Recovery Program, those funds won't be accounted till the actuals come out for those years, because those will be basically grants. And like I said, we do a little program of grants that we know are coming, but those will be captured at the final tally. So they're not in this tally.
All right, thank you, Mr. Magnus. Let's move on to item number 3, which is a presentation regarding COVID-19 full-time equivalent cuts and restoration. And looks like Mr. Magnus is up again on this one.
Let me share my screen. Share. Okay, this is the yearly exercise we go through to see what's happening with and now for some reason my computer, there we go. So for FY22, these are the general fund FTEs that were cut or add. So parks lost, fire gain, community neighborhood services gain, legal gain, economic development gained, police have gained, and engineering has gained. I'll explain each one as we go through. There are 2 positions that were cut during the COVID. One was an economic development management analyst that was cut, and it's now a permanent cut. And one from IS was cut, and that is now permanent. So those 2 positions are not coming back. Economic development did get one of the positions they had lost during COVID. It's a management analyst. Engineering, they lost 2 FTEs during the COVID cuts. They're both being restored. That 0.5 is a new intern coming on. Actually, they're going to increase the hours the intern they have. Community neighborhood services. So during the COVID cut, they had 2 positions moved from their department and were funded through CDBG funds. They left 2 code compliance officers open. So what we have now coming back to them are the 2 positions are no longer funded by CDBG. Those positions are coming back. 2 code enforcement officers are going to be filled. One at the start of the budget and one not till after the first of the new year, not fiscal year, but 2023. A parking coordinator was added towards by the council last month, so that is a new FTE coming to them. And then 1.6 FTEs were accidentally excluded in the budget year, FY21 budget year. So those have been added back. So those are really what's going to be funded this year is going to be the parking coordinator and the 2 code enforcement officers. Parks and Rec, they had 1 employee that was rifted during the COVID because the youth sports wasn't seen as something that was going to be used a lot. So that position has been brought back, but there's still 2.5 FTEs. And these are adjustments. What happens is in the formula on the spreadsheets that deals with part-time employees, it calculates hours, it assigns them a number. There was an error in it, so it was over-assigning the FTE number. So it's just a correction. They still have the same staff, just on the books it looks different. Police, right as it sits right now, they are gaining 3.2 FTEs. 1 is for a new sworn officer. There was 2 positions that were excluded from the 21 budget, and then a part-time position hour adjustment. It was the same thing as the Park District. It's a formula error. They assigned them more weight on the FTE side or less, depending on the hours worked out. Fire got a half a FTE for a part-time management analyst. The rest of their positions that were either frozen or were slowly being filled, those will all be coming back. Legal services, it's a 1 point FTE gain. Again, it's a corrected formula for part-time employees. So it shows up as a 1.3 FTE gain, but it's no more employees. The non-general fund, the Justice Court gained, emergency response gained, wastewater gained, energy, sanitation lost, CDBG lost, vehicle maintenance gained, and Kobe Center lost. There's one that's missing, and that should have been stormwater, and I'll explain that when I get to wastewater. Energy, there are 1.5 FTEs. 1 of it is for a new position, electrical utility locator, and then the half FTE for a new intern doing GIS CAD. CDBG funds, last year we moved 2 positions from community neighborhood services, a planner and a code enforcement officer. We funded them through the CDBG funds. We took them out. Wastewater, there's a position that's split between wastewater and stormwater. Last year, stormwater was assigned to 1 whole FTE. This year, it was split. So wastewater is gaining a half FTE. Stormwater is losing half an FTE. Emergency response, 3.1 FTEs. There were 2 FTEs that were not recorded correctly for FY21 and 3 part-time positions. Again, it was a formula error on the spreadsheet that didn't assign enough weight, so it makes them look like they're getting more, but they're not. It's just being recorded correctly this year. Sanitation, they're losing a half a FTE. This is a blue stakes position. They're not funding it this year. Position's going away. Kobe Center, it looks like a reduction, but it's not. Again, it's a formula error. Part-time positions were being overweighted, so it made it look on the books as they had 3.8 FTEs more than they're supposed to have. It's been corrected, so there's actually not a loss to them. Vehicle maintenance, they requested 2 intern positions, so that's a 1.3 FTEs that will be funded this year. Justice Court, again, was a formula error. It's not a gain, even though they're gaining FTE, it's not a new position. So the general fund and non-general fund positions, we have for FY22, there is a total of 13.5 new positions. Or if we look at it as a 1.5% increase in workforce for the city of Provo is coming, it's going to be funded for FY22. Any questions?
Questions, Mr. Harding?
Thank you, Chair Sewell. Yeah, I'd love to understand a little bit more of what the impact is on those formula errors. So, for example, looks like the Covey Center was shown as having 10 employees or an equivalent of 10 employees, but the formula should have had them as 9. Does that mean that they received more allocation last year and then kind of had that surplus, and now it will be reduced. And on the flip side, I think community neighborhood services showed that they had less equivalent full-time position than they actually had. So did they get a smaller allotment of money and had to fill in, because they were still paying real people? And so now their budget is going to increase this year, or was that formula error not carried into the budget allocation?
I can tackle that one a little bit, John,
Yeah,
if
go
you'd
ahead,
like.
David.
Yeah, so a lot of these formula errors, particularly the Covey one that you asked about, they're formulas that calculate the number of FTEs but don't impact the actual amount of budget that is given to the department. So we have a column in our spreadsheet that just calculates FTE for this purpose because we have a schedule in the budget that reports how many FTEs per department. There were some instances where that formula was not calculating the FTE number correctly. And so we just, as we identify them, we've corrected them. And that's what's resulted in a lot of these changes. But as John mentioned, a lot of them didn't have any impact on the actual number of employees that are authorized in that department or the amount of the budget that's in the department. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
Yes, thank you. But it does seem like even though that was just a formula error, it didn't actually affect money or whatever. It seems like when we were looking at net increases of FTEs, those corrections are being included in those totals. And so, like, for example, Mr. Magnus just kind of concluded that there was a 1.5% increase in personnel. And if I was following correctly, that included the corrections of the FTE. So we're not actually, unless I'm misunderstanding, we're not actually increasing our workforce by 1.5% because most of that was just a mistake in a formula somewhere. Is that correct?
I would say that's accurate, yes.
Okay. And I want to say that I think, again, it's a big document I may have gotten lost, but I think that is also in our in like the tentative budget. It almost treats these corrections of formulas as actual changes as in personnel. And so I don't know if that's something we want to revisit before the actual proposed budget. Because I think it would be helpful just to note that, hey, there were some mistakes in the past, but not actually show those as actual changes to personnel.
Yeah, I would just mention that there are a couple that did impact the amount of the budget that was awarded to the department, such as dispatch and police. Those ones did involve the dollar amount that came through in the budget. So I think we could look into that, maybe adding a note or a description of what changes were involving just the FTE count formula error and which ones actually impacted the budget dollar amounts.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, thank you. We'll move on to item number 4. Although I'm noticing, Mr. Strachan, it doesn't look like we have a break scheduled in here. I'm wondering.
We don't, but I don't know that anybody would mind if you took a 5-minute break.
I'm just wondering if this is the best time or if we should do it after this next item.
Well, the next item is, I guess it is Gary.
Yeah, maybe
Sure.
we should.
Your call.
Why don't we go ahead with item number 4, and then we have a long item coming up after that. So let's have a short break after item number 4, if that's agreeable with counselors. All right. So next up is a presentation from the Community and Neighborhood Services Department regarding their fiscal year 2022 tentative budget. And this item is to be presented by Gary McGann.
Hi, thank you. We're going to talk today about parking enforcement. We submitted in our supplementals, which was not included in the base budget, a request for 2 enforcement officers and some secretarial help. So we thought we'd give you a little more explanation of what this entails and some projections of what revenue we think those two enforcement officers would actually bring in once they're up and operating. So what we'd like to do is go ahead, and Sandy, who is the supervisor for parking enforcement, we'll go through our presentation, and then we'll answer any questions that you have.
All right, first of all, as you can see in the screen, we calculated we have one full-time parking enforcement officer right now. His annual salary is $64,999, and this includes benefits. Both full-time and part-time officers use the same equipment, and I've broken it down there. Uniforms run $782, pants, jackets, coat shirts. The hardware, radio, the impress battery, and a flashlight, 2,522. A printer, that's what they use when they issue the citations, and then the phone now is $45 a month. What? Okay. There we go. Okay, and then for the full-time clerical position that we requested, the annual salary for that would be $58,333. And again, this does include the Provo City benefits. Now, a full-time officer averages 4,776 citations per year. There's about 16% of parking citations, or 764, that go unpaid. 18% will be your warnings, dismissed based on an appeal, or voided officer error. We void quite a few from the airport because they've put the wrong stalls in or what have you. And so there's 3,152, or 66% of tickets are paid, for a total revenue of $126,086. Now on this, I base the tickets at the $40. Our base ticket price is $55. If the person that receives the citation pays the ticket within 7 days, we do offer the $15 discount. And so they'll pay $40. And then after 7, it goes to the issue price of $55. And after 14 days, the price is $68.75. It's increased the 25% that the state allows. This is just kind of a graph based on tickets from January 2019, the tickets issued versus the revenue collected, just so you can kind of see. Again, as we've discussed before, ticket revenue kind of fluctuates month to month, depending on when people pay, when the collections comes in, all sorts of variables. I included this going back to 2017. That's when parking started the transition. Kind of gone year by year for tickets that we've written, tickets that have been paid, warnings, appealed, dismissed, and voided. As you can see, we really have invested in training. We've invested in education for the neighborhoods, education for our residents. We are not voiding near as many tickets as we once were. The dismissal rate has gone down. Although the appeals stay about the same, again, they're mainly questions and concerns rather than the tickets have been issued incorrectly. We have increased with our warnings. Although warnings are a zero fine amount, we feel that it's important. We try to educate, and our software system will notify us if a license plate has had a previous warning. So these warnings are usually on the first violation, and thereafter they will receive a citation if they park incorrectly again. Training, full-time, part-time, the training is the same. It's usually 1 to 2 weeks of office training depending on experience. We have some employees that are familiar with Provo City or Utah State parking codes or codes. They're from the city, so they know the area. They know our different permit areas. They know what the tree streets are, you know, Indian Hills, Slate Canyon, what have you. So that training goes a little bit faster. Policies and procedures are something that we take very seriously. We have rewritten the books. We've rewritten our policies and our procedures so they're clear and well defined. Then it's at least 2 weeks of field training. When they go out, they learn to write the citations with the phones. POB 311 cases, these are unique. These are our residents' concerns that we do respond to. New officers need to know what the procedure is, what the expectation is. Timed parking, we have many timed parking areas throughout the city. We try to get them very familiar with that. 1 hour versus 2 hour, student versus the downtown. And then our permit areas. They're all a little bit different. Again, it does take extensive training. 2 weeks is the minimum, I'll say here. We have 33 violations that we enforce, both city and state codes. We respond to an average of 85 POB cases per month. With a full-time officer, these cases would be handled more consistent and effectively. Right now, I'll have an officer respond. If it's a part-time officer and they work the first part of the week, we're trying to juggle when he's marking the tires or the vehicle to see if it's been there for 72 hours. Then we're trying to pass it on to the officer that comes in at the end of the week while they're also trying to mark their vehicles because of those POB cases that come in. It becomes very confusing for the officers. It's doable, and the parking enforcement officers are doing a great job. But the residents do call wanting to know while we're not out there and why we are not consistently enforcing neighborhoods. Permit areas. We have the University Garden. As you know, it goes from 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. The Foothill is 12:30 a.m. to 5:30 a.m. is no parking, and then permit kicks in during the day. And then Carterville is 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. permit required, and then the library. And I do want to clarify POB. I probably should have explained that. I do apologize. It's point of business. It's calls that are coming in through our 311 system. And when the customer service representatives take these calls, there's a criteria of questions that they ask the residents so we know and we're better informed of what the problem or the issue is. They send it through the POB software, if you will, and it comes to us daily, and it's a way for us to go in, look at the concern, look, you know, if the resident wants contact, if they just would like us to come out and mark the vehicle, we can put notes in. That way, if the resident calls into customer service again, we're all on the same program, if you will. And so the customer service reps can see the notes that we put in. We can see the notes that the customer service reps have put in. So we're not constantly going back and forth for information. And then when we close it, they will be able to see that as well. It's just a way to keep track. We are, I believe, going to City View with this in a few months. This is just the program that we're using right now. Okay, and then, so I'll go back to the library parking permits. They run from 8 p.m. to 10 a.m. A permit is required, and then 2 hours from 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. And of course, this is only when BYU. We have winter permits and fall permits. We are not running a permit program there during the summer. Okay, and I just froze. Okay. Apologize. Downtown. Okay, right now, time parking in downtown is 2 hours. It's from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. I have a part-time parking officer that is assigned there. He's been assigned there for several years, and he works from 9 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. So after 2:30, if he's marked an area, we do try to pick up and go and enforce in the afternoon. It does become difficult again, because that's the one officer that I have patrolling the city. With a vibrant downtown, new development, if there is any extension of the timed parking in the downtown, a full-time parking officer will be needed in that area. Do I need to explain what POB is again? Would that be helpful, or should we wait until the end of the presentation?
Just keep going.
Keep going, okay. Okay, here's a summary. Full-time parking officer would be $64,999. The equipment would be $4,199. So again, the total is $69,000. You double that for a second officer. The full-time clerical would be the same. The cost, as you can see, is $127,531 versus $196,729. And again, the estimated revenue is there, which means if I had one full-time parking officer, I would be $1,445 short of a full-time parking officer and a full-time clerical help. If we doubled that and hired 2 full-time parking officer as requested and the full-time clerical, we would be ahead $55,443. Any questions?
As we've gone in and analyzed the parking situation out there right now, with the enforcement people we have, we're at capacity. We really can't extend hours in any area. We can't keep up with the enforcement requests that we get called out on through the POB system. And POB is just somebody calls 311, and it's a tracking system that lets us know of parking problems in the city. We're having trouble keeping up with all of those things right now. Anytime somebody goes on vacation, or we especially with part-time people, we continually have people quit, come on, we're constantly training. We think that there is more parking enforcement that could be done, and that if we had parking enforcement officers, that they would be fully engaged. And based on our past experience, we would project that each officer would bring in around $125,000 in revenue each year. And so any questions?
Mr. Harding.
I think I've got a 3-parter here. First, and this even goes back to the first item that I had some questions in this area. Just in certain places in the discussion, seems to be that a parking coordinator is being added in this upcoming budget. The way I've viewed it, and I understand that there's different ways to view it, but I saw that as a mid-year appropriation of the current fiscal year, not something that we're adding to the upcoming year, though it's an ongoing expense, so it needs to go in there. And I appreciated how I believe Mr. Strachan characterized it, to continue the new funding recently appropriated for a parking coordinator. So I guess my question on this is, we did appropriate some money this current fiscal year, correct? And where are we at with in the hiring process for that parking coordinator?
The parking coordinator, we're hoping to have that job description out and start getting applications next Monday. We're working on that, and that's parking coordination. And what we're talking about here is parking enforcement. So even if we didn't have a parking coordinator and we just continued as we are right now, without a parking coordinator looking into new parking, new things like that, we would still have this parking enforcement need that we're talking about today.
Okay, thank you. I that was exactly what I was looking for. So, and then I just wanted to clarify, my understanding is that this is a supplemental request for these additional 2 to 3 positions. And I just want to make sure I'm thinking about this correctly. In the tentative budget does not call for that supplemental to be granted. Basically, it doesn't put the money for that. Okay, so I got a nod from Mr. Parker. So that is a request, but not a request that is currently being contemplated or proposed to be filled. I guess then my last kind of question / comment is, we have talked about creating an enterprise fund to kind of encapsulate all of our parking management activities, and I think this is it's just kind of an example of how that might be helpful, because then it's very clear what the revenues are and what the expenditures are, and because I mostly agree with that analysis that we should be able to add some positions and not negatively affect the general fund, because the revenues would offset those costs. But my understanding is, at least with these general fund type things, that's not typically how we look at them. And so if the council were to say, oh yeah, we really agree with this presentation, administration, please go back and work this into the budget, they wouldn't necessarily, I don't know, I mean, maybe they could, but it seems like years past, my experience has been, we haven't gone back and increased the projected revenues in order to then direct this money. So and maybe I'm wrong on that, but it seems that if we were to, prioritize this request, something else would be cut by roughly the same amount, even though our expectation is for greater revenues for that. So I'd love.
Now, Wayne or John can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think the base budget that you have in front of you anticipates the increased revenue from increasing the parking enforcement officers.
Mr. Chairman, that is correct. We have not anticipated the revenue. Let me just say at the outset, and I don't at all disagree with Mr. Begin and Ms. Busio on the strategy here. I think the concern we have had historically on a policy basis is we don't want to necessarily make the assumption that more staffing will result always in more revenue. Those tend to be more policy level discussions. For example, we could certainly hire 6 more traffic enforcement officers in police. They could probably write enough citations. You might not like the backlash from having written 6 times more traffic citations in a year than we did the prior year. And so again, I think the simple math, I think, it's a good indicator. It may not end up being the final result, and it could have an impact in the general fund beyond what we're expecting here. So again, I just caution that as we think about this, that's another factor to consider. If the council felt comfortable, 4 of you felt comfortable to put this in the budget the way it's been described, we would put it in the budget the way it's been described. But again, the analogy doesn't carry on into infinity, right? I mean, at some point you could have 60 parking enforcement officers and no one would park illegally, and this council chamber would be full of people every Tuesday night. So again, there's a place somewhere in here where there's a sweet spot, and I just don't know if this is it or not, but But again, if this is something you feel that strongly about, we would certainly do it if that's what you want us to do.
Thank you,
And
Mr.
I don't know that this is the sweet spot either. I can tell you, based on what we're seeing, we could issue more tickets. But it is an important policy question for the council to weigh.
Councillor Ellsworth.
Yeah, you had said that if we did hire another full-time parking enforcement officer, that you anticipate that would bring in 125,000 annually in revenue. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And is that based on what we're bringing in now, or where did we come to this number?
Yes, that's based on what we're coming in now. Again, 66% of tickets that go paid, based on what the full-time officer writes now and the warning. I subtracted them because there's no fee amount for them.
Okay, thanks.
Mr. Chair, if I could also mention some of the costs that Gary and Sandy have referenced are one-time cost of equipment, uniforms. Some of it's ongoing because we provide allowances, but in other cases, it's just outright purchase. So again, when we look at the analysis, we've assumed first year expenses and first year revenues. And again, I think if you were to recognize that with some first year expenses that might not necessarily be ongoing, it probably is a break-even proposition, not a net loss in the first year. So in deference to that, the ongoing cost probably does get paid on its own. And again, we just have to work through on the equipment cost. But again, $4,500 or so in equipment cost and $1,200 in shortfall gets balanced out pretty quickly. So,
Thank you. Mr. Harding.
Thank you. I thank you for that description. I appreciate it. On my notes, I wrote down, can we really expect a linear increase? And if there's sufficient pent up demand, meaning sufficient violations that are going enforced on at this point, perhaps we could add to, and perhaps it would be fairly linear. But I appreciate the policy aspect of that. I think we've always talked about enforcement in terms of actually compliance. We're not looking to enforce. We're not looking to pay people salaries by writing tickets. We're looking for compliance. And I do agree that as expectations, as enforcement becomes a little more predictable and credible, that compliance, we get better compliance. And as we get better compliance, perhaps we can cut back on enforcement. And I think that's actually a win-win all the way around. I really appreciated Ms. Buzio's description of education, and that's the goal. And if we decide to move in this direction, I hope we almost redouble our efforts as far as education. I'm thrilled to hear that we're paying attention to has this license plate received a warning in the past? Because I would almost like that to be the default, that everyone's first infraction, maybe even every 12 months would receive a warning. Because again, we're looking to educate and achieve compliance, not necessarily fund positions. But if we're at the point where we're so understaffed to try to reach that predictable and credible enforcement, I like the idea of at least considering a move in this direction. And I think it's kind of rare where we can add a position and have it kind of pay for itself. So I appreciate this whole discussion. I think it's something that we should consider.
Agreed. Any other questions or comments? All right. Thank you very much for this presentation.
Thank you. We know this is a difficult policy issue to balance, and we appreciate your time.
Thank you. Let's take a 5-minute break now and reconvene for our next item at 4 o'clock, or shortly thereafter, I guess. for the resumption of our work meeting and would like to move on to item number 5, which is a presentation from the Public Works Department regarding their fiscal year 2022 tentative budget. And this item is to be presented by Dave Decker, Public Works Director.
Thank you, Chair Sewell, and thank you to the council, to the administration for the opportunity to make this presentation today. I have to tell you, I would prefer to be in person where we've got a hybrid meeting started, but I think they decided that presentations are probably a little bit easier to be done over Zoom. So we're going to cover just a couple of items, most of which the council has heard in the Public Works presentation. I've actually taken the first couple of pages right out of the previous presentation. And the items that have been highlighted in red are really key items that we would like to focus the council on. Most of these are either specific items that are unique to the budget or need specific action from the council, either confirmation or specific action during the adoption of the budget and the tentative budget. So I'm not going to go into any details on any specific project unless the council has questions on these projects. This is the second page, and again, we've highlighted on this page specific items that need council action that as part of the budget process. And again, if there's details that or questions that the council has, I'd be happy to talk about any specific either financial or technical details on these projects. We wanted to very quickly cover ASR and the proposed water treatment plant. I just want to mention, as I indicated in our first presentation, in the budget documents, you can see at the bottom of the water CIP, we have included a $30 million project for construction of a water treatment plant. And this is identified as outside funding. I indicated earlier to the council that we are pursuing several different funding sources, grants, and different stimulus package funding from both the state and the federal level to obtain funding for this project. The council should be aware many of those applications, we are requesting the entire amount for both ASR and the treatment plant. So the applications are showing about $70 million worth of projects, which include about $50 million for the full treatment plant and about $20 million for ASR projects. We could, if funding was less than the $70 million, we could do a smaller treatment plant and only part of the ASR projects. And that's why we're showing $30 million on the budget. But I don't want the council to be surprised if they see applications or they hear through some sources that we are applying for larger sums of money, and because we are. And our intent with the treatment plant and ASR is to come back to the council about mid-year, report to the council any grants or applications that have been approved, and then get final authorization to move forward with ASR and the water treatment plant. This is just a summary about the water treatment plant, reasons that we're recommending it. One thing that I've added at the bottom of this list since the last presentation, I know last week Don Jarvis spent quite a bit of time on sustainability, and he briefly mentioned that water is one of the sustainable goals for many cities. And I just wanted to make sure that the council understood that from a sustainability standpoint, ASR and a treatment plant is right on target. For many cities, this is one of the key goals that they make for sustainability. And so that certainly falls in line with his presentation and other goals that the council has set. So I want to move on to the next action item that specifically needs I guess this is just a confirmation from the council, and this is relative to rate increases. We were asked by the administration to look at, instead of doing rate increases on July 1st and making them effective July 1st, to look at a 2-month delay till September 1st. And I believe the budget that's been submitted by the administration to the council anticipates this 2-month delay. So as part of the consolidated fee schedule in the budget, we would still show the rate increases for both water and for wastewater, but we would right now we would recommend a 2-month delay so that the rate increases are effective September 1st. One other thing relative to water rates, I mentioned earlier in the first presentation that the state legislature passed a bill some time ago, it's 2 or 3 years ago, requiring tiered water rates. And I do not believe that the current budget that is in front of the council anticipates a tiered water rate. So again, as part of the consolidated fee schedule, Public Works would strongly recommend that we adopt a tiered water rate. In my previous presentation, this is the recommended tiered water rate structure that we would recommend to the council to adopt. You can see on the right-hand side the current rate and then the proposed 5% rate, what each category of residents and commercial businesses would experience with those rate increases and with the tiered water rate. And again, as I mentioned in the first presentation, these tiered water rates are quite large tiers. In many cases, you'll see either a 2 or a 3 tiered system, and generally they're around 10,000 gallons, in some cases even smaller, 8,000 gallons for each tier. And as I mentioned earlier, our tiered water rates, we're recommending quite a large tier, 100,000 gallons on the residential side and a 500,000 gallon per month on the commercial side. Most of the residents would not go into that second tier. There's a few, probably about 5% of our residential accounts that are the larger apartment complexes. Those are the ones that are only going to be, accounts that go over 100,000 gallons per month. So most of the residents would not see any difference in their water bills because of the adoption of the tiered water rate. Now, as I indicated earlier, this may raise some questions, particularly from state officials, if we have a strong enough tiered water rate. But I think our information over the last 10 years clearly shows water conservation efforts from the residents being very consistent. And I'd be happy to share that graph again with the council if you're interested. But our water consumption is well below the state goal for conservation by 2025, and that's generally the goal of a tiered water rate, is for encouraging water conservation. But I think we're well on our way on the conservation goals. So this does specifically again require some action on the part of the council with the adoption of the consolidated fee schedule with the budget. I'm just going to mention very briefly wastewater funding really is pretty much set. I will mention that we have a project that will start this spring, the Southwest Lift Station, that will essentially put the backbone into operation for the wastewater system on the west side. That Southwest Lift Station and the force main will be completed in the spring of sometime probably in the fall actually of 2022, and it will generate development potential on the west side in a significant way. And so I wanted to make sure that the council was aware of that there are a few projects on the west side as far as priority that probably ought to be discussed, but they actually are part of next year's budget, and would be happy to talk about that priority during the next budget. I also wanted to mention funding for the treatment plant is in place. There's no real action being requested, but obviously this is one of the big projects that's happening in the city. I also wanted to mention the airport. As you well know, the airport terminal and the associated projects at the airport are well underway. I will mention and it's been discussed briefly about security issues. We have some funding, some operation issues at the airport that will need to be addressed at some point. We had submitted some supplementals, but indicated in those supplementals that they would likely be needed toward the end of the upcoming fiscal year 22. So with the airport planned to be completed in the spring of 22, those positions will likely be needed about a year from now. And it also is very dependent upon new airlines and new expanded operation at the terminal. So right now, we don't have any indication or a firm indication of expanding operations. We're simply moving our operations from a current building to the new building. But sometime, during the year, we could start to get more interest. In fact, we anticipate some more interest. And at some point, potentially need to come back to the council and talk about additional funding for operations at the airport. And so that's one of the issues that probably needs to be in the back of the mind for the council, but no specific action is required at the airport, at least from the public works side at this point. There are a couple of unfunded projects, some maintenance and also monitoring system. And in both cases, we feel like at this point, we probably ought to approach the FAA about these projects and look for some additional funding on these projects outside of the city funding sources. So that's the goal right now at the airport. A couple of things on from the engineering side that are of interest. I think there are of interest from the council that, again, specifically need some action from the council. And I'm actually going to show you a different list. So this is BNC and street projects, CIP projects that are unfunded at this point. So they are included in the budget, but they do not have a funding source. And there's a number of projects here. Center Street, I know the council's talked about Center Street improvements. Slate Canyon Drive, Draper Lane is actually a couple of fiscal years out, but I will put one other that's not on the list. 1450 East is another project that that there's some discussion amongst the council about moving that forward. And we do have some funding for that project, but probably not an adequate amount for more than one traffic circle. I mentioned in our previous presentation that there are a number of sidewalks. Some of these are critical to safe walking routes to elementary schools. Two of them are on Canyon Road. One of them is on 600 South near Sunset Elementary. We also mentioned the Franklin neighborhood. There's 3 or 4 blocks of sidewalk there. And right now, our approach to the Franklin neighborhood, we have approached, or we've submitted an application for CDBG funding, which is also controlled by the council. And so that's our recommendation for the Franklin neighborhood, is to fund that through CDBG. We also have an intersection improvement on 2230 North that is unfunded at this point. So each of these projects, if the council is interested in moving these projects forward, there needs to be a funding source identified. And I've spoken a couple of times to individual council members about options. I know there's some funding, I think it's called the legacy funding for CIP projects that's available. The council may have stimulus funding that they anticipate coming, but at this point, as my understanding, none of these projects right now are have an identified funding source. And I'm just going to move through. These are some slides from the previous presentation that we've included. This is a list of Center Street improvements. I believe the council has a copy of this list. If any of the council members need a hard copy or an electronic copy, would be happy to forward the list of the Center Street improvements to you again. And again, we've recommended about $250,000 for Center Street improvements to start, and this would enable us to move through the upper part of this list, items that are relatively easy to move forward on Center Street. These are pictures of some of the sidewalk projects that I mentioned earlier, leading to some of the schools in the area along Canyon Road, and then also on 600 South, missing sidewalk. And the intersection improvement that I mentioned on 2230 North. The last items that I'm going to mention to the council that are that need some identified funding sources actually relate to parks. The regional sports park, you can see near the bottom of the list, project 12 and 13. They the road projects are identified on this list, and you can see it doesn't impact the current fiscal year, but in fiscal year 23 and 24, the upcoming fiscal years, we've anticipated about $4.5 million in street funding alone. So this is not associated with anything inside the park itself, nor with utilities. This is just street funding. And you can see on this air photo, we've tried to highlight where those streets would need improvement near the park. So in purple, at least on my screen is purple, along the east edge of the regional sports park, there's a major road and also a smaller road that cuts through the park. And then along the northern boundary of the Lakeview Parkway, those improvements will need to be done associated with the park. And right now, Public Works does not have a funding source for those street improvements, and they are not included in the cost provided to the council by the Parks Department. At least that's my understanding. So again, with upcoming funding sources, potentially from federal stimulus money or some other source of money, the council may choose to act on the streets portion of the parks in order to fund that project. I will mention one other park project to the council that I believe is being moved up as far as a priority, and that's the park proposed on Canyon Road at about 3900 North between Canyon Road and Timpview Drive. We're being told by the Parks Department that is being moved to the current fiscal year, and that's up one fiscal year. We had not anticipated in Public Works doing improvements on that park until next fiscal year. If that is the direction from the administration, from the council, we do need some additional funding for a street that's planned along the northern boundary of that park, and also utilities. The street would be about $600,000, and utilities would be another $600,000. Sewer, water, stormwater improvements on that road. So if that is determined to be a priority for the council and for the administration, the cost of the park, again, the Parks Department, I do not believe is putting in the cost for the road and the utility improvements needed. So if that project's moved up and accelerated, we would need another $1.2 million to complete the street and utilities associated with that part. So with that, that's actually the end of my presentation. I wanted to do it fairly quickly and concisely for the council. I'm happy to answer any questions or go back to the first pages so that you can see the summary of actions needed from the council during the budget process.
Mr. Shipley.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss some of this stuff. I had it in the back of my mind as things we need to go back to, but I appreciate having an opportunity today to discuss. Couple quick things. First of all, so for me, we talk about the tier rates on the water, and you had presented the 2-tier, and basically the idea is that we don't want to impose a new fee when we're doing so well as a city on the conservation front already. Has any thought been put to, in the spirit of what I think the state was trying to accomplish, breaking that into I don't want to say a more complex tier system, but a tier system that would maybe charge, the folks who really are using very little, a little bit less than we currently are, making up for it with people who are using more. And I know that we don't need that to necessarily accomplish our conservation goals, and we definitely don't want it to be an additional fee or tax overall, to our citizens. But I guess as we're talking about this, I'm just thinking, well, in the spirit of what the state was trying to do, I think there is some value in potentially, helping motivate and reward folks who are trying to conserve as much as they possibly can.
So to answer your question, yes. Mr. Shipley, we studied this quite extensively. We had Bona Collins hired as a consultant, and they issued a couple of different memos and some different options. One of the options did include actually a 3-tiered system, with the first tier actually receiving a slight adjustment down from the current water rates, so that there was a little bit of an incentive for somebody that really did a great job in conserving. The question that we had on that option, though, was we had to balance out the revenue side in order to make it revenue neutral for the city. We didn't want the water fund also all of a sudden to have a shortfall in funding for some of the projects that are happening, and so that in order to make it revenue neutral, we had to decrease the number of tiers. So in that particular case, each of the tiers was 10,000 gallons. And that 3rd tier was particularly high as far as the dollar amount being recommended. I think we were up around, in the summertime, we were well over $2 on the proposed rate. I'd have to go back and look at it. But if the council is interested, I'd be happy to send out the memo that was generated from Bona Collins. You can see the other options that were presented. There were 2 other good options that we put together, each of them with 3 tiers. But in the discussion with the consultant, we kind of felt like this might be the very best option for the city to consider, what you see on the screen.
So I'd be curious to get those other options, but I trust that we're going with what you guys feel is best. And I trust your opinion on that. I did have a couple other quick questions, if I may.
Yeah, that's great.
One is with the wastewater plant. It was my understanding that the technology there is good enough, actually, in other places to make that water drinkable, which sounds kind of crazy, but could it act as a backup for our city's drinkable water if needed? I mean, I guess I just want to verify that. So
let me clarify, as far as the process that's being installed at the treatment plant. It's called an MBR, membrane bioreactor system, and it's the most advanced. It's very common in Southern California, Arizona, Texas, a lot of places that they have one other process. It's called reverse osmosis, or an RO system. Reverse osmosis actually takes out some of the additional minerals and some of the other content that sometimes comes out and not removed with an MBR plant. That process generally is added on the end of the treatment plant in locations where they do use water in the drinking water system. So we do not have reverse osmosis added to the end of the treatment plant. But if the council, let me say, the end result, the effluent coming out of the treatment plant, could certainly be used for other sources like secondary water, or another source. Or if somebody wanted to add the RO treatment on the end of the treatment plant, it certainly could be done, which is, again, common in other states, Western United States.
And just as a contingency, how costly is that to add?
I need to go back and look. I wouldn't want to venture to guess. I need to go back and look on the memo what an RO system on the end of the treatment plant would add.
Okay. One just quick question on applying for grants and funding for the ASR/water treatment, kind of that package that you talked about at 70 million. When we start to have discussions about ARP funds, does that change or does it change your ability to get other grant money, if we're actively, trying to earmark something? Because in my mind, I'll just be frank, I've always thought, well, some of the ARP money could be used as a down payment for, water treatment. Right or wrong, that's just one of the things I've been thinking. And I just don't want it to potentially change your ability, to get grant money or other, obviously we want any kind of funding that would be accessible, to the city, and don't want to change, or mitigate your ability to do that. So does that in any way change your ability to get those grants or other funding sources?
I don't believe so. I have never gotten any hint from any of the staff, the agencies where we're making applications that that would inhibit our ability to get funding from a different source. In fact, a few of them have actually indicated that there's a discussion going on about the federal stimulus package where some of the money may actually be required to be used for infrastructure, specifically water or sewer. I don't know how that's going to end up, but again, I've never been told that that money would potentially impact our application at another agency. So I don't see any reason at this point to steer the council in a certain direction.
Thank you.
Mr. Harding.
Thank you. I've got a couple of questions, 3 questions, but I'll do them one at a time. So there was some, this is, I think, the second time we've been presented with the question of do we want to move forward with a 2-month delay? And I don't think it was asked as clearly this time, but what to do with the 200,000 that we would be giving up or not collecting this year, or the 250 for the other fund. I don't know if this is. I haven't thought it all the way through. Maybe I don't know if this is the right answer, but perhaps we could look at doing the 2-month delay. I actually think that makes a lot of sense, rather than hitting the residents with an increase on the peak months that they're paying these bills. But if we have already calculated what we'd be giving up by not having it in place for those first 2 months. So instead of a 5% increase, could we do a 5.5 or a 6% increase or whatever it's necessary to make up for that money? That way, this year we would have the same revenue, and then in the future, if we continue to do that 2-month offset, because the rate is already a little bit higher, it's not like every year it would need to be a higher rate. And even at the tail end of when we reach the plateau where we need to be and we drop down to just kind of maintenance fee adjustments, it would actually be smaller than that last year. But to me, as a rate paying resident, I think that makes a lot of sense to not have it hit on those peak months, but still have the revenues be the same. So that would be my recommendation, at least to look into, adjust the proposed rate slightly to make up for the difference.
We're happy to give, Mr. Harding, we're happy to give you that number so that is an option for the council when they adopt the tentative budget and the final budget. We're happy to give you that.
Thank you.
Councillor Ellsworth.
Did Mr. Harding have more questions?
Pardon?
Oh, I thought Mr. Harding had a number of questions.
I'm happy to yield the floor.
Okay. I did not realize when we approved that park in the Northeast that there were associated road or construction costs there. Are there other projects that we've approved? I mean, now I see it with the regional sports park. What other projects have we approved that have associated infrastructure costs?
So those two that I specifically mentioned are the ones in the immediate fiscal years where it impacts public works. There's roadway and utility improvements that are needed adjacent to the parks. And that's specifically why I brought those two parks up.
Okay. Are there other projects that require infrastructure upgrades, like a grocery store on the west side?
So we do have a potential grocery store on the west side. Depending on the final location, we do have a plan to provide infrastructure to those locations. And I was kind of hinting a bit if it's located in the northwest corner. I mentioned the priority of sewer projects when I had the map up on the west side. I can go back to that map. That map right there. It's a little bit hard to read, but you can see the years where those different projects on the northwest, the red and the cyan color, the light blue, they're scheduled in 2024 and 2025. And there's some flexibility depending on development, like a grocery store or something else, where those projects could be switched around in order to provide sewer service, particularly in the far northwest corner of the city, if it was needed. And so that's kind of what I was alluding to in my conversation about priority in future fiscal years.
Okay, that's helpful. Yeah, I think it's important to have this. Well, I'll just say I wish that we had had this information about the infrastructure necessities when we were approving the allocations to the legacy funds.
Mr. Hardy.
So this is another, I think it's on, it's just the light is out. This is in response to some of the projects that were being discussed. And I think this is mostly just a conversation with my fellow counselors. I hope that's appropriate in kind of a work session setting. We talked about sidewalks, particularly sidewalks that impact safe routes to schools. And I think a handful of locations were identified. And I think those locations are very helpful to kind of understand what the scope and the seriousness of the item is. But that's an example of where I feel like the council should really be at high level policy, where we say, sidewalks are a priority. And I think we do that in part through our funding, where traditionally, I believe we've set aside $500,000 each year for sidewalk improvements. If we feel like that's insufficient to provide the level of service of sidewalks that we want, we need to be prioritizing that and maybe cutting in another spot in the budget, to make that match our level of our prioritization. But to me, that's the level that we should be at. I hope we're not going to be asked to, go through a list of different sidewalks that impact different schools and their safe routes to school and asked to weigh in on those. I'd much rather just kind of set that level of service. And then Mr. Decker, I've been very impressed with your past presentations on how, particularly with road maintenance, and the software that's been acquired and all of the work that goes into judging road conditions and service life remaining and all of that, and optimizing so that we treat the whole city fairly, and we're prioritizing based on what's going to allow us to maintain the roads at most efficiently at the lowest cost. And I would hope that we could do that with sidewalks as well. Set the priorities that that safe routes to school is, should bump them up in priority, but then allow Public Works to go through and decide, which sidewalks should be prioritized and then fund them year to year to year and get through the highest priorities as quickly as we can that way. And I would say the same thing about streets. I'm aware of a few different streets that residents have traditionally complained about. I think it's 1460 East. In one area, there's Slate Canyon Drive, and another 900 West is one that's I'm more familiar with because I'm closer to. But I imagine that there's probably others throughout the city as well where the residents have asked for some improvements to that, and I think as well. Again, I'm open to the discussion about, have we struck the right balance on where we put our transportation funds, to roads versus, or I should say, like vehicular travel lanes versus bike lanes versus sidewalks, active transportation type things, and where should that level of service be as far as safety, and should we be looking at these traffic roundabouts and all that stuff. I think that's definitely something that we can revisit, make sure that we've got the right balance. But once we set that balance, once we set that expected level of service, once we kind of set how much money we want to dedicate to that kind of line item, I really think that we should allow Public Works to go through with their formulas and determine, like, okay, we think we should prioritize the roads in this order, and move through them, obviously as quickly as we can, rather than coming to the council and saying, okay, we have this X number of dollars here, which of these 3 projects do you want to fund this year? I really would prefer to stay out of that. If we feel there's a problem with the formulas, if we feel there's a problem with one area of the city, getting priority, or one area of the city, being neglected, I mean, we definitely can bring that up, but I think we should understand what the system is that's already in place, and support that system, and not get involved at the project level, just stay at the priority level. So that would be my plea to the council on this item.
Thank you, Mr. Hardy. Mr. Hanley.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Decker, for this presentation. I think Public Works has the disadvantage of not being quite as exciting in terms of, what is visible to, first of all, a lot of what you're proposing here isn't even visible to the naked eye for most citizens. They're not going to know what's underground. And sometimes they may not even want to know what's underground. And so these projects are all so important. And I'm just wondering, in light of the possibility, I mean, we have some remaining funds to think about on our part on the council from the previous CARES Act money, and with the prospect of more funding coming from the federal government. Your list of unfunded projects here, I think, is very helpful. And I don't know if it's implied in what you were presenting as clearly as it needs to be, or whether I was not able to assimilate all the information in such a short period of time. But it would be very helpful, I think, not only for Public Works, but maybe also for Parks and Rec coming, and energy, maybe all the departments for that matter. But if there's a handful of really important, valuable, unfunded projects on the horizon, I'm sure from the administration's point of view and from our point of view on the council, it would be helpful to know, what would be some criteria that we could use to evaluate the priority list, and see whether or not that's something we would want to put money toward, or whether that's something that we would want to fund in some other way. Because it's a lot. I mean, it's a lot to assess, and it's a little bit of a struggle to prioritize it all in my limited brain. So whatever help going forward you have for us to make some strong suggestions for the unfunded projects, I think that would be very helpful.
Well, I think my response would be, when, as the council, during the last 6, 8, 12 months of council meetings, Public Works tries to pay attention to, specific areas and projects that are being mentioned. Center Street has had a pretty extensive amount of discussion at the council level. Slate Canyon has certainly had a lot of discussion. Several of the sidewalk projects have been mentioned by the council, and so we're trying to be sensitive and understand what's critical and what's on the mind of council members, both individually and as a group. And so that's partly why we brought the list that we have to the council's attention. But I also kind of along the lines where Mr. Harding was going, we do have a fairly regular program, particularly in street maintenance, and I would actually not recommend the council dive into those areas. We've got a good maintenance plan. It's very long, forward looking, and I would hate to have somebody try to prioritize certain streets from a maintenance standpoint over another street, just because of the nature of the program and the process that we go through. But I will say one of the areas that the city has struggled traditionally is roads, particularly building new roads and road modifications to existing roads. We've been relatively successful in getting money from MAG and other funding sources for new, brand new roads that are regional in significance, and that's why MAG will fund a road like the Lakeview Parkway, because it's regionally significant. But many of the roads that we're talking about, even the road next to the regional sports park and Slate Canyon Drive and Center Street, the section that we're talking about, at least on Center Street, is not on a regionally significant road section, and so MAG won't fund those roads. There's no funding source outside the city for these smaller roads, and when I'm not looking just at automobile traffic. You realize that they benefit in many cases pedestrians, bikes, and other transportation methods. So I think the one thing that I would comment on is just the overall funding source for new roads that are not falling in that MAG plan. And we've always struggled to find funding sources for those kind of roads. And so it's a little bit of a harder conversation and a harder priority, because there are a number of needs and probably not enough funding.
Thank you. And I have actually very much appreciated the way in which your presentations to the council have always been responsive to our discussions. That's definitely been very helpful. And I appreciate that context. And I think it'll be up to us to take a closer look at this as well, to figure out where we would want to put our priorities. But your input's always valuable to us. Thanks.
Mr. Harding.
This one should be really short. It's along the lines of the sidewalks and streets that I spoke of earlier. Parks, I think, is another issue where, I think set the level of service, allow Parks and Rec to prioritize and the timing and all of that. But with that, I was curious, a while ago, I got really excited over a level of service map. That it was explained that it was a beta. I was curious if we had any progress on moving that out of beta. I learned a lot by looking at that map, but there were a few spots that it seemed like we needed to make some adjustments to, or whatever, or possibly different parameters of how it was done. I was just curious if we're still making progress on that, and when I might play with it next.
We've made good progress, and I'm happy to send that to the entire council. We can get that to you so that you can take a look at it.
Thank you.
Are there other questions or comments related to this item? All right, thank you, Mr. Decker.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your time this afternoon.
All right, we'll move on to our last item, which is mostly an opportunity for discussion, I believe, but Mr. Strachan has something to present related to that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Surprisingly, we have a lot longer left in this meeting than I thought we would. So we may get out of here early, depending on what you want to talk about. We have a few more meetings coming. And so one of the things that we're going to want to know from you is, what do you want to hear about? I've got a number of things I've written down today. One of the questions I've got that I think the administration is working on is, these ARP monies. And as you look at the guidance, I did look at the high level guidance that the League of Cities and Towns sent out. And in many ways, it seems to me that most of that money in our context, because we don't have health departments, et cetera, probably will end up being in some kind of infrastructure. Wayne may have some more detailed information than I do, but I do think that one of the questions I have is whether or not, if we put money into infrastructure, can that free up general funds for other things? Maybe a question to look at. So number of questions I've written down are, what additional items do you want to hear about? Where would you like us to focus on upcoming meetings in terms of the budget? The carryover committee had some discussion yesterday about where to go with its work. We feel like that committee, that the work has largely been done. I think the discussions we've had with the administration have been enlightening, and I think we found ways to improve the process. But you're going to be getting a budget resolution very soon as a council, and in there probably needs to be some more discussion about what intents statements do you want to put in there, what on anything specific with respect to future carryovers. We've had last few years, we basically had some element of 50-50 for innovation funding and for general fund. But as we talked about other potential items in different committees and different conversations, there have risen up. We've had discussions about disaster recovery fund. We've seen a discussion from the administration, a proposal to have a recreation equipment capital replacement type fund. Dave Harding earlier today talked about some kind of parking enterprise fund. So one of the questions I have for you is, as we get closer to June 1st, what items are you going to want to consider creating and actually putting in the budget, or at least identifying that we have to establish different funding sources and things like that? Talked about the ARP funding. That was one of my questions. I did have the thought that one of the things we could ask the departments to do, and for council to also look at, is compile a list of some one-time projects that you might be able to use either legacy or ARP funds, or free up some monies using other those funds for capital projects, if we can, that you might want to push through. So those are things I want you to think about. We took a note down about having an executive session on cybersecurity, and I think we can probably arrange that in the next couple of weeks. And then I think there's some more question about, how do some of the things in your priorities that don't rely on a specific appropriation, but rely on kind of an actual work plan, how do those get carried out? So those are just some of the things I've been thinking about. I would suggest at this point that we just open it up to council. Maybe administration has something want to talk about. Is John Borgett still on hand?
Yes, I'm here.
John, we talked earlier about taking a few minutes to talk about the changes to the tentative budget that were made yesterday that are now on a link online, which I've also emailed the council now directly with that link. Do you want to just give an overview of what you've done with that?
Sure. Very minor changes. The primary change is the additional officer that we talked about earlier. Basically, the officer that's been added and then 2 civilian positions that were removed. That affects a number of things. It affects not only the cost for the officer, but the uniform and the equipment that's needed. It also affects a vehicle, which comes out of the vehicle bank. And so those are the primary changes. There's a couple of other minor things that probably they're not really material. I'm happy to discuss those, but that's principally what the changes were. Other than that, it's the same.
Okay. We're planning on having the required public hearing on the transfer on the 1st of June. You'll see that on the agenda. Plus the budget items are actually the budget itself and the various budgets that you have, like the stormwater budget and all that, RDA budgets. Those will actually be at a public hearing on the 1st and 15th of June. And unless the council considers some kind of property tax increase or not, you probably, we'll have to discuss about having a truth and taxation hearing sometime in August if you want to go that route as well. So I see a hand up, Mr. Hanley. Mr. Hanley.
Yeah, I just have a couple of preliminary thoughts, if that's okay, on what you're asking for. One thought is that, I want to make sure that the ARP money does in fact target and help the populations who've been hurt the most by the pandemic. I'm not really thrilled with the idea of just handing out a certain amount of cash to every citizen in the city or something like that, in part because I don't know that it really, helps the people who need it the most. I think it probably makes everyone feel good, but I don't know that it actually is as effective in the way that we would like to. So I'm not entirely clear how to do this. And maybe some of this is already taken care of, or what remains to be done is not as massively significant as the amount of money that's available. It doesn't feel like that to me. But I'm thinking of some simple things like, I know Hispanic Roundtable held an event last weekend to try, or it was either last weekend or it's coming up now, I'm not remembering, but to try to encourage members of the Hispanic community in Provo to get vaccinated, and education about vaccination. People have been hit really hard by COVID in our community. I think if there's some way to identify who the most affected have been, I don't know if there's certain neighborhoods in Provo that have just been especially hurt and therefore even farther set behind over the long term in terms of the quality of life that they enjoy in their neighborhoods. If there's some way we could think about benefiting in a more surgical way, I think I would be open to those ideas, even though, again, I'm not sure I understand yet how that could work. I just want to make sure that we're not assuming that, as long as we have taken care of a couple of things, that we've sort of can go on and use it for a lot of really fun things that are beneficial to the community as a whole, but not necessarily helping the people who've been hurt the most. So I just want to put that out there as a principle, with the acknowledgement that I myself don't know yet exactly how that would work. But I'll feel a lot more confident, pushing for other projects if I know that we haven't just passed right over it. One thing that just came up yesterday this morning, with the Foothills Committee that we want to bring to the council for further discussion is the possibility of appropriating some funds to, and maybe we've exhausted the rest of the council's goodwill. I hope not, but as we thought about the sustainability plan, we know that we were already talking on the Foothills Committee about a Foothills and Canyon plan that we needed to develop a steering committee and sort of put together some ideas for that. Shannon brought up the possibility of expanding that to the river and the lake, and then proposed the idea that maybe we go back to design workshop and invite them to make another change order that maybe is subsequent to the general plan and sustainability plan, but that won't slow it down, but would allow us to get outside consultant help to work with our planners and develop some first-rate plans for the foothills and canyons and for the river and the lake, and also the gateways for Provo on South State Street and Center Street and University Avenue. And anyway, so we're intending to have that conversation and make that request to you, Chair Sewell, to put on a future work meeting. But I just wanted to throw that out there as a possible appropriation for funds. We don't yet know. Robert's going to talk with Design Workshop to find out what this would cost. But our planners seemed and our staff seemed very excited about the idea. Gary McGinn liked the idea. It would allow us to really actually expedite these plans that are probably, given the bandwidth of our staff, may be slow in coming, but this would actually, they feel like it actually is a kind of synergy with the consultants to sort of maximize their time, and they feel like it could advance these projects pretty quickly and also end up with some really fine products. And these are not, I don't think, major expenses. I think we're talking relatively modest compared to other things that we're looking at here, but I just wanted to throw that out there as a possibility. So those are just a couple of preliminary thoughts.
I might add before I turn the time to Wade, but one of the things we have to remember as we go through the budget, if we are 100% funded or close to it, that when we go to make adjustments for, add something, we probably have to take away somewhere else, or we have to add revenue somehow. And those are things we're going to have to talk about in terms of trade-offs.
Thank you. Mr. Parker?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Just you were asking for ideas about what to spend some time on between now and the adoption of the budget. And I think John Magnus raised some really interesting questions around the revenue projections. And I've been texting back and forth with John Borgett and suggesting that maybe we ought to program sometime between now and mid-June to really take a little bit of a deeper dive in terms of revenues and how they play out. I think there was, at least my read was, there was some sense that when we're talking about $15 million, it's across a $300 million budget, not a $60 million general fund. And again, some of these, being able to put some of these things in context and talk about how we arrived at some of our financial forecasts, and as he suggested, some things we know that council staff might not have seen yet in terms of year-to-date projections and where we think some of those are coming from. Sales tax this year was a very, very interesting process because we had to factor in stimulus payments and unemployment numbers, which artificially inflated what happened with sales tax or during the pandemic period. And so again, there were a number of factors that played into our estimating that probably would be worth spending a little bit of time on in a work meeting. So just to let you know, we'd be prepared to do that if that would be helpful to council.
Excellent.
I think it would be helpful. Thank you, Mr. Parker. I thought there was another hand up. Councilor Ellsworth.
Yeah, it was me. Mr. Hanley was talking about some really strong ideas that I'm supportive of. And I wonder if he was referencing the ARPA funds, that's what we call them, or if he is referring to fiscal year 2020 budget.
Sorry, could you say the last part? I didn't quite hear. Or the ARP
The
money?
ideas, yeah, the ideas that you presented, us helping those who have been most impacted by the pandemic, and the funds for a foothills and natural resource plan and a gateway plan. You were referencing the ARPA funds, or were you referencing the fiscal year 2020 budget?
Well, there's both, right? We have the are you talking about the 1.9 legacy funds?
Well, in my mind, I'm separating the tentative budget from the 1.9 legacy funds from the 30 million ARPA funds.
Yeah.
And what were you referencing? Where would that money come from? Would it be in the tentative budget? Or would it come out of this money that we're getting from the feds?
Well, I was just saying with regard to the money that's coming from the federal government, I want to make sure that that money does the maximum good for the most affected by the pandemic. That's all I was saying.
Okay, yeah, I wholeheartedly agree, and I was just confused if you were talking about the tentative budget for ongoing funds. And I guess my comment is I still stand by the council's objectives. I think there were 5 of them that we submitted to the administration. I think that we should see those adequately funded and yeah, we should look for specific outcomes so that we're able to give the best possible direction to the administration and see that actualized in the budget. I think it would also be helpful to sooner rather than later convene the council in order to discuss the 1.9 million legacy funds and the 30 million ARPA funds, because that will in some way impact our tentative budget.
Thank you. Mr. Strachan, did you have something to say?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think part of the reason I raised some of these items was just a recognition that these things are coming at us at some point. And it's my recollection, I think, Wayne, you said before that before the city can accept or actually appropriate the ARP meetings, we've got to appropriate them as revenues or monies, ARP monies as revenue, and then appropriate them for wherever we're going to use them. So that's still coming. But it just in terms of the larger context, I mean, Shannon's right. They are separate items. But just I know there's a lot of conversations going on in different meetings and that talking about, well, how do we adjust these planning issues that we have? How are we going to address some of these infrastructure issues? And inevitably, the federal funds come up in a discussion, and just need to recognize where they are in the process, but know that they may be or may not be the solutions to some of the questions that we have. So I go back to that earlier comment with that if we're only dealing with this budget and not willing to put some things off, if we can address them later, then we've always got that question of, do we raise revenues or do we make cuts in other things to fund other things?
Thank you. Mr. Harding?
Thank you. I still have a few questions, from item 1. There's one box that you get to. It's a hot box on the second page, talking about. Is it now on? Okay, my light bulb has gone off. Okay, thank you. All right, so this has to do with the council priority on improving zoning enforcement effectiveness. And under the tentative budget, it lists 2 code compliance, I assume officers, 2 community and neighborhood services. I imagine that's personnel, 1 economic development position, and then some development service operating expenses. I believe I've been working off of the updated budget from last night, and I thought what was interesting in that is it actually called it 1.5 for the code compliance officers. I couldn't quite figure that out because I thought we were at down to 4 where we had been 6. But regardless of whether it's 1.5 or 2, I think it's I think we're all clear that that those were positions that were frozen, and so we had them allocated at 6, and we've been at 4, and so we're moving that back up to 6. Or I apologize. I think that's the one where they had been funded out of CDBG, and we're moving them back.
Yeah, so there are, so in terms of the changes in community neighborhood services, so the 2 positions that came out of CDBG were a management analyst that was put into CDBG, who's being converted to a planner position. That's Melissa McNally, and 1 zoning enforcement officer that was targeted at eligible neighborhoods for CDBG. So part of that is we're taking both of those positions and moving them to general fund in large measure because the council just a couple of weeks ago adopted the plan for CDBG for the coming year and didn't include those positions. So we pulled those back out in order to preserve them and keep them in the general fund. And then we had, again, a couple of positions that had been, that stayed in the general fund, and we're adding them back because they were frozen during the hiring freeze. So that took us to 6 now in zoning enforcement. The economic development position and development services operating budgets really are in operating or in development services, not in community neighborhood services. So I think they were lumped there to talk about trying to meet your priority, but they're not funded in community neighborhood services.
Okay, thank you, Wayne. I think that the point I just wanted to make is when I first looked at some of the narrative on the budget, I was thinking, oh wow, this is a big increase for community neighborhood services, kind of perhaps for zoning, for planning, and definitely for code compliance. But if we look at this, and I think also there was something in there where we had a formulaic problem, and so the 2 were being added in. And I thought I think it's on another document, we're showing like 5.5 new FTEs. And I just wanted to make sure it was clear that I believe all of those, it's just getting us back to the pre-COVID levels. None of this is actually, though I think there is a net plus half FTE, but other than that, I think all of that was just getting us back to pre-COVID levels. So that was the last comment or last questions I had on that. As far as some of the discussion that we've had about some of these planning projects, master plans for the foothills and the canyons and for the lake and the river, I'm supportive of that. I agree that I think we're pushing the limits of this budget already, and so anything we add needs to come out from something else. But we have this very unusual opportunity with some arrived and expected funds from the federal government to do some one-time projects, and I support using that for some of these planning efforts. I would say that in talking with planning, I had the opportunity to sit down with some of the planners recently, and we were talking kind of big picture stuff on some of this. And we're going to have a new general plan, but we're also going to have code that mostly comes from the 1970s, and really, we've struggled even using this code to implement our previous general plans. And for as long as I've been engaged with the city, there's been this talk of, oh boy, we would love just to overhaul the code. And this might be a really good time, both because we have this funding potentially available, as well as we will have had a new general plan. It might be a very good time to say, okay, well, let's redo our code, and let's revamp our code so it can support the general plan and the policies and principles that we're approving with the general plan. So I think there's a lot of opportunities. I've mentioned it just recently. It really dawned on me just how much I think the lack of bandwidth that we have in our planning functions to support both the council priorities as well as to tackle some of these big projects. And perhaps the best way to do that at this point would be to look to outside consultants and one-time money to push these forward. Because I think if we can get over the backlog, planning will be able to stay on top of the kind of the day-to-day stuff a lot better. So that's my as far as planning and what was commented, proposed earlier. I support it, and I think we should seriously consider that when we're looking at the one-time monies. And then the final thing is to answer Mr. Strachan's comments or question about what else do we want to talk about. I learned a lot in the carryover committee discussions, and I think it's pertinent to the discussions we're having now. I think it would be good perhaps if I'd propose that the council give some time in a future meeting for the carryover committee just to kind of report out our findings and recommendations, and help make there's a couple decision points for the upcoming budget. I think that's important. And one thing just coming out of that is we really probably should be looking a little bit at the outcomes from past budgets, specifically since we're currently in the 2021 fiscal year, looking at the completed fiscal year 1920 and looking at what were we trying to accomplish with that budget and what outcomes did we get from that budget, and then using that to kind of inform what we're going to do with the upcoming budget, the 21-22 fiscal budget. So I would welcome a discussion on that in an upcoming meeting.
Thank you. David Mortensen has a comment.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Sewell. I just wanted to make one clarification that I think would answer one of the questions that Mr. Harding had regarding the 6 positions in community and neighborhood services. So the tentative budget does include restoring them to 6 code compliance officers, but one of those would be recommended to start on January 1st. And that's why it's showing up as a half FTE. So that's probably why you saw 5.5 instead of 6. I just wanted to make that clarification.
Thank you. I had a question. On that $500,000 or so in the initial presentation on that had to do with the new IT infrastructure, the new phone system and that. Is that coming out of the normal operating budget? I mean, that seems like a one-time expense. So I'm just wondering if we found another funding source for that. Does that free up?
It is a one-time expenditure, and it's coming out of fund balance in those 2 internal service funds. So again, we could have brought that as a simple appropriation to you. We thought since we were so close to submitting the budget, we just include it in the budget. So it doesn't have any impact on the general fund, and it's basically just an appropriation of existing fund balance for a one-time purpose.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair, I think if there's, I don't see more questions on our hands up, but I would suggest now at this point that either we could adjourn early and pick this up again next week. We'll probably have an hour or 2 on budget items next week in addition to our regular load. And then in the meantime, I can talk with Wayne and John and figure out what presentations and timing of them coming up in the next couple of weeks. The goal is to have you by June 1st being able to wrap up those discussions, and probably whether we have time on trying to get my dates here, 25th, or if we wait till the work session on the 1st, but my thinking is that somewhere along the way, if there's any adjustments to be made, we'll need to work on recommendations for those and then put them in the budget. But right now, the plan is next week on the 18th, you'll be adopting tentatively adopting the tentative budget, I think we call it. And then, so that'll be in effect, but you'll have the formal process on the 1st and 15th of June.
Sounds good. I did have one request on the parking enforcement. That just based on the revenue projection numbers we saw, of course, that sounds like a good idea, but I was wondering if the administration, if John Borgett's team would be willing to sort of take an independent look at that and give us your estimate of what the budget would look like if we fully funded the 2 positions plus the whole package, and what's your independent estimate of the revenue effect of that? I mean, if it really is close to what the expenditure would be, then it seems like a pretty good idea.
Yep, we'll be glad to run through those numbers and give you.
Yeah, happy to do it.
Yeah, thank you. Let's see, Mr. Hoban, Mr. Fillmore, Mr. Shipley. I'm trying to think who hasn't commented this last round. Anything you would like to see in terms of preparation for upcoming meetings?
I just want to try and figure out how we're going to accommodate the need for additional police officers.
Mr. Hanley?
Yeah, I just had a quick question I meant to ask earlier to Dave Decker if he's still available. And it's sort of not really, well, I guess it is somewhat budget related, but it's just about the anticipated drought that we're going to have this summer with a pretty weak winter. And I'm just wondering if you anticipate any problems there, and does that affect our aquifer storage effort? How does that affect us generally as a city? And should we be, or are we already pushing for water conservation to be on everyone's mind?
Well, I think the way I would answer that question, we need, yes, the answer as far as should water conservation be on everybody's mind, the answer is yes. And we have some education tools that we're already putting out relative to water conservation. It's obviously going to be, a challenge during the summertime. We're probably not recommending at this point to take an aggressive approach, restricting water to certain days or, a certain number of times per week for residential homes. And we're trying to take more of an education and self-involvement approach with the residents and kind of managing their own resources, because overall, again, I think the city does, it's evident in our water use, the city overall does quite well in water conservation. Having said that, again, we're going to need to be careful with our resources. We have been fortunate. We've been able to accumulate about 5,000 acre feet of storage in our Jordanelle reservoir storage. I don't know if you remember the details. Some of the newer council members may not be aware, but the city has about 10,000 acre feet of storage in Jordanelle. We also have some storage in Deer Creek on a regular basis through the Metropolitan Water District of Provo. And both sources, we've been able to accommodate some extra surface water. So we feel like we're fairly well prepared, at least in this initial year. I think our bigger concern is if this goes on for another year or another year beyond that, it's a whole nother ball game. And I think that's why we're recommending an approach with ASR so that we have some long-term storage. That's really the goal of ASR. Is it's not about surface water, which is relatively short-term storage. ASR is about long-term sustainable water sources. So it does play into the conversation about ASR.
Thank you.
So before we close, I just want to make sure that every counselor had a chance to express any questions or directions that you have for staff in order to get prepared for our next meeting. I see Counselor Ellsworth's hand up. Go ahead, Counselor.
I'm wondering if we should set a date or create a timeline for when we can discuss the 1.9 legacy funds and the ARP funds.
Okay, we'll discuss that in leadership. The thing about the ARP is we want to make sure we know what we're getting and what we're allowed to use it for, so that it's a little tricky on the timeline from that standpoint, but we'll discuss it. Mr. Hogan.
I just wanted to let you all know I'm good. Thank you. I think everybody's covered most of the topics I was interested in.
Great, thank you. All right, well, I'm not seeing any more hands up, so unless there are any objections, we will adjourn the meeting for today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.